History does not remember everything. Some events are recorded, then contradicted. Some are documented, then erased. What remains are gaps, dates that don't align, artifacts with no explanation, accounts that vanish from the record entirely. A civilization abandoned with no evidence of war or disease. A discovery buried, then removed from official archives. A pattern repeated across centuries, dismissed as coincidence. No consensus has been reached. No explanation has held. Tonight, we examine what the historical record actually shows, and where it simply stops. Let's start with what's known. On the northern coast of what is now North Carolina lies a narrow barrier island, low and windswept, fringed by marsh grass and maritime forest. Today, Roanoke Island is quiet. Tourists visit its reconstructed fort, its lighthouse, its small museum. But beneath the calm surface of this landscape lies one of the oldest unsolved mysteries in American history, one that has puzzled historians, archaeologists, and amateur investigators for more than 4 centuries. In 1587, a group of English colonists, 115 men, women, and children, arrived on Roanoke Island under the sponsorship of Sir Walter Raleigh. They were meant to establish a permanent English settlement in the New World. Among them was Virginia Dare, the first English child born on American soil. Their governor, John White, returned to England for supplies shortly after their arrival, promising to come back quickly. He did not return for 3 years. When White finally made it back to Roanoke in 1590, he found no one. The settlement was dismantled, not destroyed. Fences still stood, but the houses were gone, taken apart carefully rather than burned. There were no signs of battle, no graves, no bodies. The only clue left behind was a single word carved into a post: Croatoan. Another carving, on a nearby tree, spelled out the letters Crow. Croatoan was the name of a nearby island and the Native American tribe that lived there. It seemed to suggest the colonists had relocated, perhaps peacefully, perhaps under duress. White intended to search for them immediately, but a storm damaged his ship, and he was forced to abandon the search and sail back to England. He never returned to America again. The 115 colonists were never found. For centuries, historians have debated what happened. The most widely accepted theory is also the simplest. The colonists integrated with the Croatoan people, or another nearby tribe, adapting to survive in a land that had already defeated one English settlement before them. Some evidence supports this. Reports from early explorers, including John Smith decades later, describe encounters with native communities who spoke of light-skinned people living among them, wearing European-style clothing. Was this the lost colony absorbed into a new life? But not everyone agrees. Some researchers point to signs of conflict, arrowheads, a possible massacre site, tensions with the Powhatan Confederacy recorded in later colonial accounts. Did the Roanoke colonists meet a more violent end, one erased entirely from the historical record? Then there are the fringe theories, the ones archaeologists rarely endorse but can't fully dismiss either. Some point to the so-called Dare Stones, a series of engraved rocks discovered in the 20th century, allegedly recording the fate of the colonists in their own words. Most historians consider them forgeries, but not all of them have been definitively debunked. Others speculate about disease, famine, or something in the historical record we simply haven't uncovered yet. Modern archaeology has added new fragments to the puzzle. Excavations on Hatteras Island, believed to be the historical Croatoan, have uncovered English artifacts: a signet ring, gun parts, fragments of slate for writing. Are these remnants of the lost colonists themselves, or simply evidence of trade between English settlers and native communities elsewhere? More than 400 years later, the fences are gone, the post is gone, and the word Croatoan survives only in written accounts of what White claimed to see. What became of the men, women, and children of Roanoke remains unknown, swallowed perhaps not by violence or catastrophe, but by something quieter, assimilation, silence, and time itself. The question that has haunted historians since 1590 remains unanswered. They didn't disappear without a trace. They left one word behind. The question is whether we've ever truly understood what it meant. The Tower of London sits on the north bank of the Thames, its white tower rising pale and squat above battlements that have witnessed executions, imprisonments, and conspiracies for nearly 1,000 years. Tourists walk its grounds today, drawn by the crown jewels and the ravens said to protect the fortress from ruin. But few linger long enough to consider one of its oldest and most troubling secrets: the fate of two boys who entered the tower in 1483 and were never seen again. Their names were Edward and Richard. Edward, aged 12, was the rightful king of England. Edward V, son of the recently deceased Edward IV. Richard, his younger brother, was 9. Upon their father's death, the boys were placed in the care of their uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who had been named Lord Protector. He housed them in the Tower of London, at the time not unusual, as the tower served as a royal residence as much as a prison. But within months, everything changed. Edward's coronation was postponed. Clergy came forward, claiming the marriage of the boys' parents had been invalid, making both boys illegitimate and unable to inherit the throne. Parliament agreed. The Duke of Gloucester was crowned King Richard III. The two young princes remained in the tower, and were gradually seen less and less by the public until they were not seen at all. By the end of 1483, they had vanished entirely from the historical record. What happened to them? For over 5 centuries, this question has divided historians, and the most widely accepted theory is also the darkest: that Richard III, having taken the throne, ordered his nephews killed to eliminate any rival claim to his crown. This account was popularized by Tudor-era historians, most famously Sir Thomas More, writing decades later, who described the boys being smothered in their sleep and buried secretly beneath a staircase within the tower. In 1674, workers renovating the tower discovered a wooden box containing 2 small skeletons buried beneath a staircase, seemingly confirming the old accounts. King Charles II, believing them to be the lost princes, had the bones interred in Westminster Abbey, where they remain today, sealed within an urn. For centuries, this seemed to close the case. But does it, really? The bones have never been definitively identified. Modern forensic science, DNA testing, precise age analysis could potentially resolve the question, but the Abbey has not permitted such examination. Without it, historians are left relying on 17th-century assessments, conducted with far less rigorous methods than we have today. Are these truly the remains of Edward and Richard? Or could they belong to someone else entirely? Other children who lived and died within the tower's long history. And if Richard III did not order their deaths, who did? Some historians point instead to Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, once a close ally of Richard III who later turned against him. Buckingham had access to the tower and motives of his own. Some theories suggest he acted independently, hoping to clear a path to the throne for his own ambitions, or perhaps acting to frame Richard and destabilize his rule. Others suggest an entirely different narrative, that one or both princes may have survived. This theory gained unexpected support decades later, when a young man calling himself Perkin Warbeck emerged in Europe, claiming to be Richard, the younger prince, having escaped the tower as a child. Warbeck gathered support from foreign courts and mounted a challenge against King Henry VII, Richard III's successor, before ultimately being captured and executed in 1499. Was Warbeck a calculated impostor, as Tudor historians insisted? Or could his claim have held some grain of truth, however faint? Then there are theories that move further from the mainstream. Arguments that Henry VII himself, having taken the throne from Richard III by force, had greater motive to eliminate the princes than Richard ever did. After all, as long as the boys lived, they represented a more direct claim to the crown than Henry's own lineage. Could the accounts blaming Richard III have been a convenient narrative, shaped by a new dynasty eager to justify its rule, and blacken the reputation of the king it had overthrown? Historians remain divided, and the debate continues to this day, revived in recent decades by discoveries such as the 2012 excavation of Richard III's own remains beneath a parking lot in Leicester, a find that reignited public fascination with the king and renewed scrutiny of the stories told about him. What is certain is this: 2 young boys entered the Tower of London in the summer of 1483, and by winter they were gone. No contemporary account describes their deaths directly. No body was confirmed at the time. Only decades of second-hand testimony, political motive, and fragmentary evidence remain. Enough to construct several plausible narratives, but not enough to prove any of them beyond doubt. The bones in Westminster Abbey remain sealed, undisturbed by modern science, their secrets, if they hold any, locked away by tradition rather than certainty. Perhaps one day permission will be granted, and DNA testing will finally offer an answer written in the boys' own biology rather than in the words of chroniclers with agendas of their own. Until then, the tower keeps its silence, much as it has for over 500 years. 2 boys disappeared behind its walls. Whether by murder, conspiracy, or a survival lost to history, the truth remains where it has always been, just out of reach, somewhere within the old stones of the tower, waiting to be found. The Bastille no longer stands. Demolished during the French Revolution, its stones scattered and sold as souvenirs, only a faint outline remains today, marked in the pavement of the Place de la Bastille in Paris. But in the late 17th century, this fortress prison held a prisoner whose identity was considered so dangerous, so potentially destabilizing, that he was never permitted to reveal his face, not to guards, not to fellow prisoners, not even, some accounts suggest, to himself in a mirror. He became known, centuries later, as the Man in the Iron Mask. The documented facts are sparse but consistent. A prisoner, his identity withheld even from those who guarded him, was moved between several French prisons beginning in the 1670s: Pignerol, Exil, the Îles Sainte-Marguerite, and finally the Bastille, where he died in 1703. Correspondence between prison officials and the court of King Louis XIV survives, referring to this prisoner only by pseudonyms, most commonly Eustache Dager. Guards were under strict orders. If the prisoner attempted to speak or reveal anything about his identity, they were to kill him immediately. Contrary to popular imagination, historical records suggest his mask was not iron, but black velvet, worn only during transport and select occasions rather than continuously. Still, the intent was the same: total concealment. Why would the most powerful monarch in Europe go to such extraordinary lengths to hide one man's face? The mainstream historical theories begin with straightforward political motives. Some historians believe the prisoner was a disgraced servant or minor figure privy to a dangerous state secret, perhaps involved in a poisoning scandal or court conspiracy that, if exposed, could have embarrassed the crown. Under this theory, the mask was not about who he was, but about what he knew. Other historians point to a name that appears more prominently in the records: Nicolas Fouquet, once France's powerful finance minister, imprisoned for corruption and mismanagement of state funds. Fouquet had extensive knowledge of the kingdom's finances and inner workings, information that could prove damaging if revealed. But Fouquet's imprisonment and death are relatively well documented, leaving many unconvinced he was the masked man of later legend. But it is the more speculative theories that have captured public imagination for over 3 centuries, theories that move beyond servants and ministers to something far closer to the throne itself. The most famous, popularized by Voltaire in the 18th century and later immortalized by Alexandre Dumas, suggests the prisoner was an illegitimate, or even secretly legitimate, brother of King Louis XIV himself. Under this theory, the man's face was concealed not because of what he knew, but because of who he resembled. If his features closely mirrored the king's own, exposing him could have raised uncomfortable questions about succession, legitimacy, or a hidden truth about the royal bloodline itself. Could Louis XIV have imprisoned his own brother, a twin, some versions suggest, solely to secure his own claim to the throne? There is no definitive evidence to confirm this theory, and most historians treat it as legend rather than established fact. Yet, the sheer intensity of the secrecy surrounding the prisoner has kept the possibility alive. Why conceal a face unless that face told a story someone needed buried? Still, other theories drift further from the historical mainstream. Some 19th century writers speculated the prisoner may have been connected to English nobility, or even a foreign diplomat entangled in a scheme so sensitive that exposure could have triggered a diplomatic crisis between nations. Others have suggested he may have simply been a man who resembled the king closely enough by coincidence to be seen as a threat, regardless of his actual birth or background. What complicates the mystery further is the treatment the prisoner received. Despite the extreme secrecy, he was not held in the harshest conditions available. Accounts suggest he had access to fine linens, was permitted to play the guitar, and dined on meals of a quality unusual for an ordinary prisoner. Was this the treatment of a dangerous criminal, or the quiet, careful containment of someone the crown considered too important to harm, yet too dangerous to reveal? When the prisoner died in 1703, he was buried under the name Marchioli, a name matching no known individual in French records. His clothing and any personal effects were reportedly burned, the walls of his cell scraped down, and his furniture destroyed. Precautions that seem excessive for an anonymous nobody, yet were never explained by the crown. Modern historians, using surviving correspondence and prison logs, have narrowed the possibilities considerably, with many now favoring the theory that the prisoner was indeed a minor political figure rather than royalty. Yet no consensus has fully emerged, and the destruction of his belongings after death ensures that definitive proof may never surface. The Bastille that once held him is gone. His true name, deliberately erased from the historical record by those who imprisoned him, has never been confirmed with certainty. What remains is the mask itself, not the object, which has never been recovered, but the idea of it. A face hidden so completely that even after 3 centuries of investigation, we still do not know whose story we've been trying to uncover all along. Perhaps the most unsettling possibility is not that his identity was extraordinary, but that it wasn't. That an ordinary man was buried beneath extraordinary secrecy, simply because someone, somewhere, decided his face was too dangerous to be seen. Whose face was it, really? And what did it reveal that an entire kingdom felt compelled to hide? The Strait of Magellan cuts through the southern tip of South America like a wound. A narrow, treacherous passage of freezing water, sudden storms and currents that even modern vessels approach with caution. In the 16th century, when European sailors first attempted to navigate it, the strait was less a shipping route than a gauntlet. It was here, in 1526, that a small Spanish ship named the San Lesmes entered the historical record, and where, shortly after, it disappeared from it entirely. The San Lesmo was part of a larger expedition led by Garcia Jofre de Loaiza, commissioned by the Spanish crown to reach the Moluccas, the Spice Islands, by sailing west, following the path Magellan had charted only a few years earlier. The fleet consisted of 7 ships, tasked with securing Spanish claims to the lucrative spice trade and asserting dominance over a route the Portuguese also desperately wanted to control. It was an expedition marked by hardship from the outset. Storms scattered the fleet before it even reached the strait, and by the time the ships regrouped, they had already lost men, supplies, and, in some cases, each other. The San Lesme, a small vessel of roughly 80 tons, became separated from the rest of the fleet while attempting to pass through the strait. According to the surviving records, fragmentary and often contradictory, the ship was last sighted attempting to navigate the passage independently, its crew struggling against violent winds that pushed vessels far off their intended course. After that, nothing. No wreckage was reported. No survivors returned to Spanish territory. No official record definitively states what became of the ship or the men aboard it. It simply ceased to exist within the historical narrative, one of countless vessels lost to the brutal conditions of early transoceanic exploration. For centuries, this was where the story ended. Another ship, another crew, claimed by the sea. Age of exploration voyages were dangerous, and losses like this, while tragic, were not unusual. The most straightforward explanation is also the most probable. The San Lesmes was destroyed by the strait's notoriously violent weather, its crew lost to drowning or exposure, its wreckage scattered across the seafloor or the surrounding coastline, never to be recovered. But is that truly where the story ends? In the 20th century, a very different theory began to take shape, one that would carry the San Lesmes thousands of miles from where it was last seen, into the mythology of the South Pacific. Some researchers, examining oral traditions among the Moriori people of the Chatham Islands and certain Maori communities in New Zealand, noted references to pale-skinned or fair-haired figures appearing in ancestral accounts, sometimes tied to unusual objects of unclear origin. Combined with isolated archaeological finds, old coins of uncertain provenance, timber fragments inconsistent with local shipbuilding traditions, and a persistent local legend regarding a bell of possibly foreign origin, a hypothesis emerged. Could the San Lesmes have survived the strait, only to be carried by wind and current across the Pacific, eventually reaching the shores of New Zealand nearly 3 centuries before European contact was believed to have occurred? This theory, most notably explored by historian Robert Langdon in the late 20th century, remains firmly outside mainstream historical consensus. Most scholars regard the evidence as circumstantial at best. Coins can be explained by later trade or loss. Oral traditions are notoriously difficult to date or verify precisely, and no definitive wreckage or unambiguous Spanish artifact tied specifically to the San Lesme has ever been recovered in the Pacific. And yet the theory has never been entirely dismissed either, in part because so little is definitively known about the ship's actual fate that the absence of evidence works in both directions. It neither confirms nor eliminates the possibility. What makes the case particularly difficult to resolve is the sheer scale of uncertainty surrounding 16th century record-keeping. Ships were lost constantly during this era, their fates often reconstructed only loosely from second-hand reports, delayed dispatches, or the absence of expected arrivals. The San Lesmes may have simply sunk in the strait, its story no different from dozens of other vessels lost to the same waters. Or it may represent something far stranger, a ship that, through storm and circumstance, crossed an ocean no European vessel was believed to have crossed for centuries afterward, its crew living out their lives among people who had never before encountered anyone like them. No wreck has ever been conclusively identified as the San Lesmes. No definitive artifact bears an inscription confirming its presence in the Pacific. The evidence remains scattered, ambiguous, and open to interpretation. Coins without clear origin, legends without firm dates, timber without confirmed provenance. Perhaps the ship met the fate of so many others in that unforgiving strait, disappearing quietly into cold water and undocumented history. Or perhaps, carried by forces no one aboard could have controlled, it became something else entirely, a fragment of the age of exploration, washing ashore in a world that would not officially discover it for hundreds of years to come. The strait keeps its silence, as it has for nearly 5 centuries. What became of the San Lesmes and the men who sailed her may never be fully known, but somewhere between a Spanish naval record and a Pacific island legend, a question remains unanswered. Did the ship simply vanish, or did it arrive somewhere it was never supposed to be? Deptford, on the south bank of the Thames, was in the late 16th century a modest waterside town, home to dock workers, sailors, and the kind of quiet houses where business, official and otherwise, could be conducted away from the noise of London. One such house, owned by a widow named Eleanor Bull, became the setting on May 30th, 1593, for the death of one of Elizabethan England's most brilliant and dangerous minds, the playwright Christopher Marlowe. Marlowe was by any measure a remarkable figure. A contemporary of William Shakespeare, some scholars consider him the finer playwright of the two in his own time, the author of Dr. Faustus, Tamburlaine, and Edward II, plays that push the boundaries of Elizabethan theater with their ambition, their violence, and their willingness to question religious and political orthodoxy. He was also, by multiple accounts, a government agent, likely employed in England's expanding intelligence network under Sir Francis Walsingham, tasked with rooting out Catholic conspiracies against Queen Elizabeth I. On the day of his death, Marlowe spent hours in that Deptford house with 3 other men, Ingram Fraser, Nicholas Skeers, and Robert Poley, all of whom, like Marlowe himself, had connections to England's shadowy world of espionage. According to the official account, the men spent the day together, shared a meal, and later became involved in a dispute over payment of the bill. Fraser, seated at a table with Marlowe behind him, was allegedly attacked from behind. In the ensuing struggle, Fraser supposedly turned Marlowe's own dagger against him, stabbing him above the right eye. Marlowe died almost instantly. An inquest was convened within days, remarkably quickly by the standards of the era. It concluded that Fraser had acted in self-defense, and he was pardoned within a month. An unusually swift resolution for a killing involving a man of Marlowe's prominence. The official narrative, recorded and largely accepted for centuries afterward, was simple: a tavern argument over money that ended in tragic, if unintentional, violence. But is that truly all this was? Marlowe's death arrived at a particularly precarious moment. Just 12 days earlier, a warrant had been issued for his arrest on charges of atheism and heresy, accusations that, if proven, could have resulted in torture or execution. The charges stemmed partly from documents found in the possession of Thomas Kidd, a fellow playwright who, under torture, implicated Marlowe in a series of allegedly blasphemous statements. At the time of his death, Marlowe was not imprisoned, but was required to report daily to authorities while the investigation continued. He was, in effect, a man under suspicion, awaiting a fate that could easily have ended his life through entirely different means. This timing has led many historians to question the official account. All 3 men present with Marlowe that day worked, in some capacity, within England's intelligence apparatus, men accustomed to surveillance, manipulation, and, when necessary, elimination of threats to the crown. Was Marlowe's death truly the result of a spontaneous dispute over a bill? Or was it something more deliberate? An assassination, arranged to silence a man who knew too much, or whose continued existence had simply become inconvenient to powerful figures within the Elizabethan court. Some theories suggest Marlowe's intelligence work had brought him into contact with sensitive information regarding factional struggles within Elizabeth's own government, perhaps rivalries between the Cecil family and the Earl of Essex, two of the most powerful factions vying for influence over the aging Queen. Under this theory, Marlowe was not killed over religious heresy at all, but was a casualty of a political struggle far larger than himself, with the tavern dispute serving as a convenient cover story. Still more speculative theories move even further from the historical mainstream. A small number of researchers and enthusiasts have proposed that Marlowe did not die in Deptford at all, that his death was staged, allowing him to escape prosecution for heresy and disappear, perhaps fleeing to the continent under a new identity. Some have gone as far as to suggest Marlowe continued writing in secret after 1593, attributing to him a hand in works later published under Shakespeare's name, a theory almost universally rejected by mainstream scholars, but one that persists in certain circles precisely because so much about his death remains, on close examination, unusually convenient for so many parties at once. What remains certain is this: a man with connections to state intelligence, facing serious charges of heresy, died suddenly in the company of fellow intelligence operatives, in a private house, under circumstances that were investigated and resolved with unusual speed. The official verdict has never been formally overturned. No new inquest has re-examined the case with modern forensic methods. The dagger, the room, the witnesses, all are gone, leaving only the inquest documents and centuries of scholarly interpretation. Was Christopher Marlowe simply the victim of a violent, unremarkable argument, as history recorded? Or did England's intelligence networks, so accustomed to operating in silence, ensure that the true circumstances of his death would remain exactly that, silent and permanently out of reach? 5 centuries later, the room in Deptford is gone, but the question it left behind has never fully closed. Gardiner's Island sits quietly off the eastern tip of Long Island, New York, a privately owned stretch of land that has remained in the same family since the 17th century. Windswept and largely undeveloped, it holds within its soil, or so legend insists, one of the most enduring, unsolved treasure mysteries in American and maritime history: the fortune of Captain William Kidd. Kidd's story begins not as a pirate, but as a privateer, a sailor commissioned by the English crown to hunt pirates and enemy vessels on behalf of the government, operating under a legal license to seize ships and cargo. In 1696, Kidd set sail aboard the Adventure Galley with a royal commission to target pirates and hostile French ships in the Indian Ocean. But over the following 2 years, his expedition grew increasingly troubled. Struggling to find legitimate targets and facing a restless, underpaid crew, Kidd's actions grew murkier, culminating in the seizure of the Quedagh Merchant, a vessel carrying valuable cargo. Whether this seizure was a lawful act under his commission or an act of outright piracy remains debated to this day. The ship sailed under a French pass, technically making it a legal target, but its ownership and cargo were tied closely enough to Indian and Armenian merchants that the seizure caused a serious diplomatic uproar. By the time Kidd returned to the American colonies in 1699, he was already branded a pirate, wanted by the English crown. Aware of the danger awaiting him, Kidd made a series of stops along the northeastern coast, and it was during this period, historians agree, that he buried at least a portion of his treasure. Most notably, and most verifiably, at Gardiner's Island, where he entrusted goods to John Gardiner, the island's owner at the time, with instructions to keep them safe. This much is not legend. Records confirm that when Kidd was eventually arrested and sent to England for trial, An inventory was taken of goods recovered from Gardiner's Island and other locations, catalogued as evidence at his trial. Kidd was convicted of piracy and murder in 1701 and hanged. His body later gibbeted along the Thames as a warning to other sailors. The treasure that was recovered was documented and turned over to authorities. But was that truly all of it? This is where the historical record grows uncertain, and legend begins to take hold. Kidd himself, in the days before his execution, reportedly insisted that additional treasure remained hidden, wealth he claimed could be used to secure his freedom, or at least a lighter sentence, if only he were given the chance to retrieve it. He was not given that chance. Kidd was executed with his supposed secret intact, and in the centuries since, treasure hunters, historians, and amateur explorers have searched relentlessly for what may have been left behind. The mainstream historical view holds that Kidd likely exaggerated the extent of his hidden wealth, perhaps as a desperate bargaining tactic to delay or avoid execution. Under this theory, what was recovered at Gardiner's Island and elsewhere represented the majority, if not the entirety, of his remaining treasure, and stories of a larger hidden fortune are largely the product of legend inflating a much smaller reality. Yet the searches have never stopped. Over the centuries, locations from Long Island to the Caribbean, and even as far as Madagascar's coastline, where Kidd was known to have operated, have been investigated by treasure hunters convinced that a significant portion of his wealth remains undiscovered. Gardiner's Island itself has drawn particular attention, its private ownership only adding to its mystique, as unauthorized searches have occasionally been reported, and the family has, at times, restricted access specifically due to persistent treasure seekers. More speculative theories have expanded the story even further. Some researchers have connected Kidd's legend to Oak Island in Nova Scotia, the site of its own long-standing treasure mystery, suggesting, with little firm evidence, that Kidd or his associates may have used the island's unusual landscape to conceal wealth using an intricate system of shaft and flood tunnels, a claim mainstream historians generally regard with significant skepticism due to the lack of direct evidence linking Kidd to the island. Others have speculated Kidd may have entrusted some portion of his fortune to associates or family members whose identities were never fully uncovered, effectively erasing any documented trail before authorities could seize it. What complicates the case further is the nature of piracy itself during this era. Cargo was often converted quickly into portable forms of wealth. Coin, gems, and precious metals that could easily be hidden, buried, or distributed among trusted allies without leaving any official record at all. If Kidd did retain a hidden portion of his fortune, the very methods that made it easy to conceal are the same methods that make it, centuries later, almost impossible to trace. No definitive additional treasure tied conclusively to Kidd has ever been recovered beyond what was documented at his trial. Gardiner's Island remains privately held, its full history known only to the family that has guarded it for generations. Whether Kidd's final claims were the truth of a desperate man, or the empty bargaining of someone with nothing left to offer, remains impossible to say with certainty. Somewhere between a colonial inventory list and 3 centuries of speculation, the question persists. Did Captain Kidd's true fortune go down with his reputation at the gallows? Or is some part of it still waiting, buried and forgotten, in ground that has never been searched? Oak Island lies just off the coast of Nova Scotia, in Mahone Bay, a small, forested island barely more than 140 acres, indistinguishable at first glance from dozens of similar islands scattered along the coastline. Yet, since the late 18th century, this particular island has drawn treasure hunters, engineers, and researchers into one of the longest and most expensive treasure searches in recorded history, centered around a single depression in the ground that came to be known as the Money Pit. The commonly told origin story begins in 1795, when a young man named Daniel McGinnis reportedly discovered a circular depression in the ground beneath an old oak tree, marked by a pulley or tackle block hanging from a nearby branch. Curious, McGinnis and two friends began digging, uncovering layers of flagstones and wooden platforms at regular intervals as they descended, a pattern suggesting the pit had been deliberately constructed rather than formed naturally. This discovery marked the beginning of over 2 centuries of excavation, investment, and, in several documented cases, loss of life, as searchers pursued whatever lay at the bottom of what became known simply as the pit. This much aligns closely with the historical record, though even here, some details remain uncertain. The earliest written account of the discovery wasn't published until decades after the fact, raising questions among historians about how much of the story had already been shaped by retelling before it was ever formally documented. But the story of Oak Island did not begin with Daniel McGinnis. Long before European settlers ever set foot on the island, and well before any treasure was allegedly buried there, local Mi'kmaq oral tradition reportedly held that Oak Island, and Mahone Bay more broadly, held spiritual significance. Some accounts describe the area as associated with unusual lights or phenomena observed over the water, long predating any European treasure legend. Historians caution that these oral accounts are difficult to date precisely, and were often recorded well after European colonization had already begun shaping local narratives, making it difficult to separate original tradition from later embellishment. Still, the persistence of these stories has led some researchers to wonder whether the island's reputation for mystery predates its famous pit by generations, or even centuries. From here, the mainstream historical explanations for the Money Pit's origin remain relatively grounded. Some historians propose the pit may be linked to early Nova Scotian settlers or military engineers, who might have constructed elaborate storage systems for legitimate, if now forgotten, purposes unrelated to treasure at all. Others suggest natural geological formations, sinkholes common to the region's limestone bedrock, could account for the pit's original depression, with the layered platforms discovered by McGinnis representing debris or root systems rather than deliberate construction, a theory that would suggest centuries of retelling transformed a natural phenomenon into an elaborate legend. More historically grounded theories connect the site to Kidd, as we've already explored, or occasionally to other pirates who operated in the Atlantic and Caribbean during the same era, using the island's isolation as a natural hiding place for goods intended to be reclaimed later. But as with Roanoke and Marlowe, it is the more speculative theories that have captured the greatest public fascination, theories that push the island's history back centuries, even millennia, before any European pirate could have set foot there. Some researchers have proposed that the pit and its surrounding flood tunnels, channels apparently engineered to flood excavation attempts with seawater, discovered by later searchers, bear resemblance to construction techniques used by Templar knights, who some believe may have fled Europe with treasure or sacred relics centuries before Columbus ever reached the Americas. Under this theory, Oak Island's engineering was too advanced for 18th century settlers or opportunistic pirates, suggesting a far older and more sophisticated origin. Others have gone further still, suggesting connections to lost civilizations, ancient seafaring cultures, or even, in the most fringe interpretations, sites tied to biblical or apocryphal legend. Theories overwhelmingly rejected by mainstream historians and archaeologists, but which persist due to the sheer scale and mystery of the island's underground engineering, much of which remains, even today, not fully mapped or understood. Modern excavations, including extensive investigations conducted in recent decades using ground-penetrating radar and deep drilling, have uncovered anomalies, pockets of what appear to be man-made cavities, fragments of wood and metal dated to periods inconsistent with 18th century activity, and water tunnels whose engineering remains difficult to fully explain using the technology believed available at the time of their supposed construction. Skeptics argue these anomalies may result from natural geological processes combined with over 2 centuries of unregulated digging, which could easily account for irregular readings and disturbed soil. What remains undisputed is this: multiple lives have been lost across generations of excavation, vast sums of money have been spent, and no definitive treasure, relic, or conclusive answer has ever been recovered from the depths of Oak Island. The pit's true origin, whether military, geological, or something considerably older and stranger, remains as unresolved today as it was when McGinnis first noticed a curious depression beneath an old oak tree. Was Oak Island's mystery born from a single act of concealment in the 18th century? Or does its history reach back through centuries of oral tradition into something that predates recorded history entirely? Beneath its soil, past the flagstones, tunnels, and flooded shafts, the island continues to answer only in fragments, leaving the question of who built the pit and why as unresolved now as it has ever been. A small, ornate silver casket, roughly a foot in length, sits at the center of one of the most consequential and contested controversies in Scottish and English royal history. The box itself has survived, passed down through private hands for centuries, though its most famous contents, a series of letters and sonnets allegedly written by Mary, Queen of Scots, have not. What remains is testimony, transcriptions, and copies, and from that fragile foundation, an entire historical case was built against a reigning monarch. By 1567, Mary, Queen of Scots, found herself at the center of a rapidly unraveling political crisis. Her husband, Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, was murdered in an explosion at Kirko Field in Edinburgh, an assassination that shocked the Scottish court and immediately raised suspicion toward those closest to the Queen, particularly James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, a nobleman widely rumored to be Mary's lover. Within months, Mary married Bothwell, a decision that scandalized both Scottish nobility and foreign courts alike, and which many contemporaries interpreted as an implicit admission of guilt. The marriage triggered rebellion among Scotland's powerful nobles, forcing Mary's eventual abdication and imprisonment, and ultimately her flight to England, where she sought protection from her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I. It was at this critical juncture, with Mary's fate and legal status still undetermined, that a silver casket was produced by Mary's Scottish political opponents, allegedly recovered from one of Bothwell's servants. Inside, they claimed, were letters and sonnets written by Mary to Bothwell, composed before Darnley's murder, containing passages that appeared to implicate her directly in planning her husband's death and conducting an affair with Bothwell well before his passing. If genuine, these letters would have been damning beyond question. Direct evidence, in the Queen's own words, of complicity in murder. And it was on the basis of these letters, presented as evidence during a series of conferences convened by Elizabeth I's government in 1568, that Mary's guilt was effectively determined in the eyes of many English officials, providing crucial justification for her continued imprisonment in England for nearly 2 decades afterward. But were the letters real? This is where the historical record grows deeply uncertain, and where centuries of scholarly debate have failed to reach any firm consensus. Mary herself vehemently denied authorship, insisting the letters were forgeries fabricated by her political enemies, a coalition of Scottish nobles eager to justify her removal from power and legitimize their own seizure of authority in her son's name. Notably, the original letters were never produced in a manner allowing for truly independent verification. Mary's own representatives were denied adequate opportunity to examine the originals closely during the 1568 conferences, and the documents mysteriously disappeared from historical record entirely by the early 1580s, leaving only copies, translations, and second-hand transcriptions for later historians to examine. The mainstream historical view remains divided, though a significant number of historians lean toward the possibility that at least some of the material was fabricated or altered. Perhaps genuine letters selectively edited, combined with entirely fabricated passages, or authentic correspondence deliberately taken out of context to imply guilt where none of the original wording had actually stated it. Under this theory, Mary's opponents didn't necessarily need to invent evidence from nothing. They needed only to reshape existing correspondence just enough to secure the political outcome they required. Other historians maintain that the letters, or at least substantial portions of them, may indeed have been genuine, reflecting a real and complicated relationship between Mary and Bothwell that predated Darnley's death by longer than Mary ever publicly admitted. Under this view, Mary's guilt, whether in the murder itself or simply in prior knowledge of the plot, remains a plausible, if unproven, historical reality. Then there are theories that move further into speculation. The idea that the letters may have been entirely fabricated by skilled forgers within Bothwell's own circle, or even orchestrated with quiet assistance from English intelligence networks eager to see Mary permanently discredited and removed as a legitimate claimant to the English throne, given her strong hereditary claim as a Catholic alternative to the Protestant Elizabeth. Under this theory, the Casket Letters were never truly a Scottish matter at all, but an early and highly effective piece of political disinformation, deployed with English interests quietly in mind. Modern paleographic and linguistic analysis, conducted using surviving copies and translations, has produced inconclusive results. Some phrasing patterns appear consistent with Mary's known writing style in other verified letters, while other passages appear stylistically inconsistent, or suspiciously convenient in how directly they implicate her. Without the original documents, definitive forensic conclusions remain impossible. The silver casket itself survives today, housed for a time at Lennoxlove House in Scotland, a quiet physical relic of a controversy whose true contents were lost to history long ago. What it once held, and how faithfully those missing letters ever represented Mary's own words, remains one of the most consequential unresolved questions in British royal history. Was Mary, Queen of Scots, condemned by her own hand, or by the skilled hand of a forger working in service of men who needed her gone? More than 4 centuries later, with the original letters lost and only fragile copies remaining, the answer, much like the casket's true history, stays locked away, accessible perhaps only to those who wrote it, and to whatever truth they chose to seal inside. The Ursuline convent of Loudun in western France was, by most accounts, an unremarkable religious community until the autumn of 1632. Nestled within a modest provincial town, it housed a group of nuns dedicated to prayer, education, and a quiet, disciplined existence, the kind of institution that rarely drew attention beyond its own walls. That changed abruptly when several of the nuns, led most prominently by the convent's Mother Superior, Jeanne des Anges, began exhibiting symptoms that, at the time, could only be explained through one framework widely accepted by 17th-century society: demonic possession. The symptoms were dramatic and, by contemporary accounts, deeply disturbing. The nuns reportedly convulsed violently, spoke in voices unlike their own, contorted their bodies into positions considered physically impossible, and, most alarmingly to church authorities, began naming a specific individual as the source of their affliction, a local priest named Urbain Grandier. Grandier was, even before the accusations began, a controversial figure in Loudun. Charismatic and by most accounts unusually eloquent, he had also made numerous enemies through personal conduct that scandalized parts of the local clergy and nobility, including rumored affairs with several women in the town, allegations of seducing a young woman under his spiritual guidance, and a written pamphlet criticizing the powerful Cardinal Richelieu's policies. A dangerous choice, given Richelieu's influence over both church and state at the time. When the possessions began, exorcists were called in almost immediately, and over the following months, public exorcisms became a spectacle in themselves, drawing crowds of onlookers eager to witness the nuns' convulsions and hear the voices that spoke through them. Voices that, under questioning by exorcists, repeatedly named Grandier as the one who had summoned demons to torment them through witchcraft. The mainstream historical explanation for what occurred at Loudun leans heavily toward psychological and social factors, rather than the supernatural framework accepted at the time. Many historians point to a documented history of tension between Grandier and the convent, as well as personal conflicts with local officials who stood to benefit from his removal. Some accounts suggest Jeanne des Anges herself may have harbored a complicated fascination, or even repressed romantic feelings, toward Grandier prior to the possessions, raising questions about whether psychological distress, communal hysteria, or a combination of genuine mental afflictions and deliberate manipulation could account for the nun's symptoms far more plausibly than demonic influence. Adding further weight to this theory is the well-documented political motive behind Grandier's prosecution. Cardinal Richelieu, already angered by Grandier's earlier pamphlet, dispatched a royal commissioner, Jean-Martin de Laubardemont, to oversee the investigation, a man with clear personal and political incentive to secure a conviction. Grandier's trial proceeded with unusual speed and severity. Evidence in his favor was reportedly dismissed or suppressed, and a supposed pact with the devil, written in Grandier's own hand and signed backward in the Latin fashion sometimes associated with demonic contracts, was presented as evidence, despite significant suspicion, even at the time, regarding its authenticity. Grandier was convicted of sorcery, tortured, and burned at the stake in August 1634. Yet, even after his execution, the possessions did not stop. This detail remains one of the most difficult aspects of the case for purely political explanations to fully account for. If the entire episode had been constructed simply to eliminate a troublesome priest, why would the nun's symptoms, convulsions, unusual voices, physical contortions, continue for years afterward, long after Grandier could no longer serve any political purpose? Jeanne des Anges herself continued to exhibit signs of possession for several more years, eventually becoming something of a celebrity within French religious circles, touring various cities, and reportedly displaying words said to have miraculously appeared on her skin, believed by supporters to be divine confirmation of her eventual celebrated exorcism and spiritual purification. Skeptics, both at the time and among modern historians, have suggested these later displays may have involved deliberate self-inflicted marks or theatrical elements designed to sustain public and religious interest, though definitive proof either way has never been established. More speculative theories, generally given little credence by mainstream historians but persistent nonetheless, suggest the case may represent a genuine, if not supernatural, example of a real psychological or even now recognized medical phenomenon. Episodes of mass psychogenic illness, in which shared psychological distress within a closed, high-pressure community can produce genuinely involuntary physical symptoms among multiple individuals simultaneously, without any conscious deception involved at all. Under this framework, the nuns may not have been lying, nor entirely possessed in the supernatural sense understood at the time, but genuinely afflicted by something modern medicine might interpret very differently than 17th-century exorcists ever could have. What remains undisputed is the trial record itself, along with contemporary accounts from witnesses across all levels of Loudun society, describing physical phenomena that, even by modern standards, remain difficult to fully explain through simple fraud or coincidence alone. Whether genuine affliction, deliberate performance, political conspiracy, or some combination of all three, the case was never definitively resolved even in its own time, and Grandier's guilt, despite his execution, was questioned by some contemporaries almost as soon as the flames had been extinguished. Centuries later, historians remain divided between explanations rooted in psychology, politics, and the deeply unsettling possibility that something at Loudun defied easy categorization by any framework available at the time, supernatural or otherwise. Did the nuns of Loudun suffer from a genuine and unexplained affliction? Or were they, knowingly or not, instruments in the destruction of a man who had made the wrong enemies at exactly the wrong moment? The convent's walls no longer hold the answer, if they ever truly did at all. Cumnor Place, in Oxfordshire, was in the mid-16th century a converted manor house, once part of a monastic estate before the dissolution of the monasteries repurposed it for private residence. Quiet and somewhat isolated, it was here, on September 8, 1560, that Amy Robsart, wife of Robert Dudley, a man widely believed to be the great love of Queen Elizabeth I's life, was found dead at the bottom of a staircase, her neck broken, her body otherwise remarkably undisturbed. The circumstances immediately raised suspicion, not least because of who her husband was. Robert Dudley was by 1560 one of the most powerful men at Elizabeth's court, and rumors had already circulated for years, suggesting an intimate relationship between Dudley and the Queen herself. Rumors serious enough that foreign ambassadors had reported speculation about marriage, despite the inconvenient fact that Dudley was already married to Amy. On the day of Amy's death, she had reportedly insisted her household staff attend a local fair, leaving her alone in the house. An unusual request that some historians have interpreted as suspicious in itself, while others note she may simply have wished for a rare moment of solitude. An inquest was convened shortly after her death, and its official verdict was death by misadventure, an accidental fall. This conclusion was not entirely without support. Contemporary records indicate Amy had been in poor health, possibly suffering from what some historians speculate may have been breast cancer, a condition that in advanced stages can weaken bones and potentially increase the likelihood of a fall resulting in serious injury. If accurate, this theory would suggest her death, however tragic, was exactly what it appeared to be. A household accident involving a woman whose declining health made her unusually vulnerable to a fatal fall down a single flight of stairs. But the political context surrounding Amy's death made that simple explanation difficult for contemporaries and later historians to accept without lingering doubt. Was Robert Dudley responsible, directly or indirectly, for his wife's death in order to clear the way for marriage to the Queen? This theory gained immediate traction at the time, fueled by rumors, and, more damagingly, by rival factions at court eager to use the scandal to discredit Dudley and prevent any possibility of his marriage to Elizabeth. Dudley himself was not present at Cumnor Place on the day of Amy's death. He remained at court, a fact his defenders have long cited as evidence against direct involvement, since a man plotting murder might reasonably be expected to arrange a more airtight alibi than simple absence, which did little to quiet suspicion regardless. If Dudley did orchestrate his wife's death, it would almost certainly have required the involvement of someone within the household, someone capable of arranging Amy's fatal fall or ensuring the staff's convenient absence on that particular day. No conclusive evidence has ever tied any specific individual to such an act, and the inquest, despite the political sensitivity surrounding the case, appears to have been conducted with reasonable thoroughness by the standards of the time, ultimately returning its verdict of accident rather than foul play. Other historians have proposed an alternative and considerably darker theory, that Amy Robsart may have taken her own life, driven by despair over her husband's rumored relationship with the Queen, and the public humiliation of a marriage that had, by most accounts, grown distant and strained in her final years. Under this theory, her insistence that the household attend the fair, leaving her entirely alone, takes on a more deliberate and tragic significance. Suicide, however, carried severe religious and social stigma in 16th century England, potentially resulting in denial of proper burial rites and lasting shame for surviving family members, a possibility that may have influenced the inquest's findings regardless of what investigators privately suspected, given the considerable incentive to record her death as accidental rather than self-inflicted. A third theory, favored by some modern historians, suggests a political assassination orchestrated not by Dudley himself, but by his enemies at court, powerful factions who recognized that Amy's death, regardless of its true cause, would inevitably be blamed on Dudley, effectively destroying his reputation and eliminating any realistic possibility of his marriage to Elizabeth. Under this theory, Amy became a casualty not of her own marriage, but of the ruthless political maneuvering surrounding the Queen's court, her death weaponized by men who understood precisely how damaging the resulting scandal would prove. What is certain is the outcome for Dudley himself. Though never formally charged, and though he would go on to remain one of Elizabeth's closest confidants and favorites for decades afterward, he was never permitted to marry her. Whether Elizabeth's own reluctance stemmed from genuine belief in his innocence tempered by political caution, or from private doubts she chose never to record, remains impossible to determine with certainty. The scandal surrounding Amy's death effectively ended any realistic possibility of a royal marriage, regardless of where the truth actually lay. Cumnor Place itself no longer stands, demolished in the 19th century. Its staircase and the exact circumstances of that September afternoon lost along with it. No modern forensic examination will ever be possible. What remains is a single inquest verdict, centuries of court gossip transcribed by ambassadors and chroniclers with their own agendas, and a marriage between Elizabeth and Dudley that never took place. Did Amy Robsart die by tragic accident, deliberate despair, or calculated murder disguised as either? Her death shaped the course of Elizabethan history as profoundly as any battle or treaty of the era, and yet the staircase where it happened has never revealed, with any certainty, precisely what took place upon it that September afternoon. The Tower of London appears once again in this history, though this time not as the setting for missing princes, but as the final residence of Sir Thomas Overbury, poet, courtier, and one-time confidant of King James I's favorite, Robert Carr, later ennobled as the Earl of Somerset. It was here, in September 1613, within a cell in the tower, that Overbury died after months of severe illness, his death initially attributed to natural causes. It would take nearly 2 years for the truth, or something resembling it, to fully surface. Overbury's downfall began not with poison, but with friendship. Specifically, his close and influential relationship with Robert Carr, a relationship that had, for years, made Overbury one of the most powerful unofficial advisors at James I's court, largely through the influence he held over Carr's own decisions and correspondence. This influence began to unravel when Carr fell deeply in love with Frances Howard, a noblewoman seeking to annul her existing marriage in order to marry Carr instead. Overbury vehemently opposed the match, reportedly viewing Frances and her powerful family, the Howards, as a direct threat to his own influence over Carr, and he made his opposition known in terms considered dangerously insulting to both Frances and her family's considerable political standing. The consequences of this opposition proved severe, whether through Carr's own diminishing patience with his former friend, or through the machinations of the Howard family, or some combination of both. Overbury was maneuvered into a diplomatic post abroad, an offer that, on its surface, appeared to be an honor, but one Overbury refused, apparently believing, with some encouragement from Carr himself, that his refusal would be tolerated without serious consequence. It was not. Overbury's refusal of a royal diplomatic appointment was treated as an act of defiance against the king himself, and he was promptly imprisoned in the Tower of London, ostensibly for this offense alone. What followed, according to evidence that would not emerge until nearly 2 years later, was a slow and deliberate poisoning campaign carried out against Overbury during his imprisonment. A woman named Anne Turner, closely associated with Francis Howard, allegedly arranged for tainted food, medicine, and even enemas to be administered to Overbury over a period of months, gradually weakening him through repeated exposure to poison, reportedly including arsenic and other toxic substances, administered in doses seemingly designed to produce a slow decline resembling natural illness rather than sudden, suspicious death. Overbury died on September 15, 1613. His death recorded at the time without any official suspicion of foul play. The truth came to light gradually, following the marriage of Carr and Frances Howard shortly after Overbury's death. A marriage made possible by the successful annulment Francis had sought, and one that proceeded with considerable royal favor, King James I himself taking an active personal interest in celebrating the union. It was only in 1615, when a lesser conspirator involved in supplying poison came forward with information, that the full scope of the plot began to unravel, implicating not only Anne Turner, but also Frances Howard herself, several lower-ranking officials at the Tower who had facilitated the poisoning, and, most explosively, Robert Carr, Overbury's former friend and one of the most powerful men in England. The resulting trial captivated the nation. Frances Howard confessed to her involvement in arranging the poisoning, expressing what many considered genuine remorse, while Robert Carr maintained his innocence throughout the proceedings, insisting he had no knowledge of the plot against his former friend. Both were convicted, though their sentences, in a decision that has puzzled historians ever since, were unusually lenient given the severity of the crime. Both were imprisoned rather than executed, and both were eventually pardoned and released after several years, living out the remainder of their lives in relative obscurity, though permanently stripped of their former influence at court. This leniency has fueled considerable historical speculation. Why would a king so publicly outraged by the murder of a courtier under his own protection ultimately spare the primary conspirators from execution, particularly when several lower-ranking accomplices involved in the plot were tried and executed for their roles? Some historians suggest personal affection. James I had shown considerable favor toward Carr for years, and some scholars believe the king may have quietly intervened to protect a man he had once deeply valued, regardless of his guilt. But more speculative theories move considerably further, suggesting the king's leniency stemmed not from personal affection alone, but from concern that a full and public execution might expose uncomfortable secrets regarding the king's own relationship with Carr, one that some historians and contemporaries alike believed extended beyond simple political favoritism into a genuine romantic attachment. Under this theory, James I's intervention was less about protecting Carr from justice and more about protecting himself from a scandal that a full public trial and execution might have exposed in far greater detail than the king could tolerate. Still, other theories examine the broader political context, suggesting the entire affair may have been entangled with larger factional struggles at court, with Overbury's death serving multiple parties' interests simultaneously. The Howard family securing Francis's advantageous marriage, rival factions weakening Carr's influence by association with scandal regardless of the trial's outcome, and the king himself perhaps quietly relieved to see a particularly troublesome and influential courtier permanently removed from the political landscape, whatever the circumstances of his death. What remains certain is the physical evidence uncovered during the 1615 investigation, testimony from apothecaries who supplied poison, corroborating accounts from Tower officials who facilitated its administration, and Francis Howard's own confession, still considered one of the most direct admissions of guilt in a case of this nature from the era. Yet the full extent of Robert Carr's knowledge and complicity, along with the true depth of King James I's own involvement or awareness, remains debated by historians who have spent centuries examining court records, personal correspondence, and trial transcripts without reaching definitive consensus. Overbury's cell in the Tower is long gone, absorbed into renovations that have reshaped much of the fortress over the centuries. What remains is a trial record, a confession, and a pardon that many historians still consider difficult to fully reconcile with the severity of the crime it followed. Was justice simply tempered by royal mercy, as the official record suggests, or did the case against Robert Carr stop precisely where a deeper truth might have implicated the king himself? 4 centuries later, the Tower keeps this secret as quietly as it once kept Overbury. Bedford County, Virginia, is a quiet, rolling landscape of forested hills and rural farmland, unremarkable to most who pass through it. Yet somewhere within this county, according to a story that has circulated since the mid-19th century, lies a buried fortune in gold, silver, and jewels, a treasure whose exact location has been encoded, deliberately and elaborately, into a set of numerical ciphers that, to this day, remain almost entirely unbroken. The story begins, according to an 1885 pamphlet published anonymously, with a man named Thomas J. Beale, who in 1820 entrusted a locked box to a Lynchburg innkeeper named Robert Morris. Beale explained that the box contained papers of great importance, and instructed Morris to open it only if Beale himself failed to return within a set number of years. Beale, according to the pamphlet, had led an expedition westward, where he and his companions discovered a substantial deposit of gold and silver, which they excavated over an extended period before transporting it back east and burying it securely in Bedford County for safekeeping. Beale departed once more, promising to send a key to decode the papers within the box should anything happen to him. That key never arrived. Beale himself was never heard from again. After waiting the specified number of years, Morris eventually opened the box, discovering 3 pages filled entirely with numbers, along with a letter from Beale explaining that the numbers, if properly decoded using an appropriate key text, would reveal the exact location of the treasure, along with the names of the men entitled to share in it. Decades later, one of these 3 ciphers, the second, was successfully decoded, reportedly by an associate of Morris, using the United States Declaration of Independence as the key text, with each number corresponding to a specific word's first letter within the document. This deciphered page describes in reasonably coherent detail a buried deposit of gold, silver, and jewels, along with a general indication of its burial location within Bedford County. The other 2 ciphers, including the one supposedly containing the precise location, have never been successfully decoded, despite over a century of dedicated effort by codebreakers, historians, mathematicians, and amateur treasure hunters alike. This much forms the accepted historical narrative, insofar as anything about the Beale story can be considered historically accepted at all. And this is precisely where the case becomes so difficult to categorize. Mainstream historians and cryptographers remain deeply divided, and skepticism has grown substantially since the pamphlet's original publication. Numerous linguistic and statistical analyses conducted on the undeciphered ciphers have raised significant doubts about their authenticity. Some researchers point to word patterns and letter distributions within the encoded texts that appear more consistent with 19th century American English, including words and phrasing patterns that some argue would not have existed, At the time, Beale supposedly created the ciphers around 1820, suggesting the documents may have been composed considerably later than claimed, quite possibly by the very individual who published the original pamphlet in 1885. Under this skeptical theory, the entire story may represent an elaborate hoax, designed either for personal amusement, to sell pamphlets, or, more cynically, to draw curious treasure hunters into purchasing land throughout Bedford County in the hopes of independently searching for a fortune that never actually existed. Indeed, at least one historian has proposed a specific suspect behind the alleged hoax: James B. Ward, the very individual credited with publishing the original pamphlet, suggesting Ward himself may have possessed sufficient skill in cryptography and creative writing to construct the entire narrative, ciphers included, purely for personal or financial motive. And yet, the case is not so easily dismissed. Despite considerable skepticism, the second cipher's successful decoding using the Declaration of Independence remains a documented fact, not speculation. Its content, while brief, is coherent and specific, describing a genuine and plausible method of treasure burial consistent with practices of the era. If the entire story were fabricated purely for financial gain through pamphlet sales or land speculation, why construct a cipher genuinely solvable using a specific historical key text rather than simply presenting numbers without any true solution at all? This question has kept the mystery alive for well over a century, dividing those convinced the story is an elaborate fraud from those who maintain that, however unlikely certain details may be, the underlying premise, a genuine, if now lost, treasure buried somewhere within Bedford County, remains entirely plausible, awaiting only the correct key to unlock the final two ciphers. More speculative theories have emerged over the decades as well, including suggestions that the treasure, if genuine, may have already been quietly discovered and removed by someone who successfully decoded the remaining ciphers decades ago, choosing to keep both the fortune and the solution permanently private, rather than reveal a discovery that would likely trigger immediate legal disputes over rightful ownership. Others speculate the ciphers may contain deliberately misleading information, planted intentionally by Beale himself as a safeguard, designed to lead unauthorized searchers toward false locations while the true treasure remains buried elsewhere. Its actual coordinates known only through details omitted entirely from the documents left with Morris. Bedford County has, over the decades, drawn numerous treasure hunters convinced of the story's validity, some of whom have conducted extensive, unauthorized excavations across private property, prompting occasional legal disputes and, in certain areas, restricted access specifically due to persistent digging. No treasure, however, has ever been definitively recovered or verified by independent parties. What remains is this: 3 pages of numbers, one successfully decoded, describing a treasure that may or may not have ever existed, buried in a location that may or may not still hold anything at all, based on a narrative whose original author may or may not have told the truth from the very beginning. Modern cryptographic tools, far more advanced than anything available even a few decades ago, have still failed to produce a definitive solution to the remaining ciphers. Was Thomas J. Beale a real treasure hunter who buried a genuine fortune, only for his final secret to die with him somewhere on the trail west? Or does Bedford County's soil hold nothing more than the residue of a very old, very convincing hoax? Until the remaining ciphers yield their secrets, if they ever do, the numbers alone continue to guard whatever truth or fiction lies beneath them. The waters between Bermuda, Puerto Rico, and the Florida coast form a loosely defined triangular region of the Atlantic Ocean, spanning roughly 500,000 square miles of open sea. Today, this area is widely known by a name popularized only in the 20th century: the Bermuda Triangle. But the earliest recorded disappearances associated with this stretch of ocean date back centuries earlier, to the very beginning of European colonial navigation across the Atlantic. Long before commercial shipping lanes were firmly established, Spanish treasure fleets regularly traversed these waters, carrying gold, silver, and goods extracted from colonial territories back toward Europe. These fleets, heavily laden and often poorly suited to withstand the sudden, violent storms characteristic of the region, suffered substantial losses throughout the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. Hurricanes swept through with little warning by the standards of the era's navigation and forecasting capabilities, and numerous Spanish galleons vanished entirely, their wrecks in many cases never located, their cargo and crews lost to the sea without a definitive account of what had happened to them. This much aligns closely with well-documented maritime history. Colonial-era shipwrecks were common throughout the Caribbean and Western Atlantic, and the specific dangers of this region, unpredictable weather, powerful currents, and, in the age of sail, notoriously difficult navigation around the numerous reefs and shoals surrounding Bermuda itself, provide a straightforward explanation for a significant portion of these early losses. Ships were lost throughout the Atlantic during this era. The sheer volume of colonial trade passing directly through this particular region simply made it statistically more likely that a proportionally higher number of these losses would occur within its boundaries. But even within these early records, certain disappearances stand out as difficult to fully explain through weather and navigational hazard alone. Some of the earliest chronicled losses include vessels that vanished not during identifiable storms, but during periods of reportedly calm weather, with no subsequent wreckage, debris, or survivors ever recovered along nearby coastlines. An absence that, while not impossible to explain through undocumented weather events or currents carrying wreckage far from the point of loss, has nonetheless fueled speculation for centuries regarding what specifically occurred within this stretch of ocean. Compounding this uncertainty is the region's unusual relationship with magnetic compass readings. The Bermuda Triangle sits near one of the few locations on Earth during certain historical periods where true north and magnetic north have aligned so closely that some early navigators reported unusual compass behavior, since this alignment does not hold across most of the globe. While this phenomenon, known as the agonic line, does shift gradually over time and has moved beyond most of the triangle's boundaries in recent centuries, some historians and researchers have speculated that period navigators, unfamiliar with the reasons behind localized compass variations, may have made significant, occasionally fatal, navigational errors while sailing through this specific region during the era when the alignment was most pronounced. This provides one of the more scientifically grounded explanations, bridging mainstream historical understanding with the region's unusual reputation. Not supernatural interference, but a specific, documentable magnetic phenomenon that, combined with the limited navigational technology of the 16th through 18th centuries, may have contributed to genuine, if explainable, disorientation among certain colonial-era ships that were subsequently lost to storms, reefs, or simple miscalculation of their position relative to known hazards. Beyond this, however, the explanations grow considerably more speculative, mirroring the pattern established by the region's later, more famous 20th century disappearances. Some researchers and writers have pointed to consistent patterns across centuries of disappearances within this specific region as evidence of something beyond ordinary maritime risk. Whether atmospheric anomalies capable of producing sudden, localized weather phenomena not fully understood even by modern meteorology, or, in far more speculative interpretations, theories involving methane gas eruptions from the ocean floor, capable of reducing water density suddenly enough to sink vessels rapidly and without extensive debris fields, a theory that remains scientifically plausible in isolated cases, but far from proven as a consistent explanation across centuries of losses. At the furthest edges of speculation, and generally dismissed entirely by mainstream historians and scientists, are theories connecting these early disappearances to more fringe explanations, ranging from unexplained atmospheric or oceanic phenomena entirely unknown to modern science, to theories popularized much later in the 20th century involving extraterrestrial or interdimensional activity, theories with no supporting historical evidence from the colonial era itself, but which nonetheless became retroactively attached to these older maritime losses once the region's modern reputation began to take shape, following a wave of mid-20th century disappearances and popular writing on the subject. What complicates any effort to reach a truly definitive conclusion regarding these earliest colonial losses is the historical record itself. Documentation from the 16th and 17th centuries is often fragmentary, reliant on second-hand reports, delayed dispatches, and inconsistent record-keeping practices, ill-suited to modern forensic reconstruction. Many ships were presumed lost simply due to their failure to arrive at an expected destination within a reasonable time frame, with little additional detail preserved regarding the specific circumstances of their disappearance. This absence of detail leaves considerable room for later interpretation, retroactive pattern seeking, and, in some cases, outright speculation extending well beyond what the original historical sources can actually support. Modern maritime historians generally maintain that the earliest colonial disappearances within this region, whatever their individual causes, likely reflect the genuine and substantial hazards of Atlantic navigation during an era of limited technology, compounded by the specific navigational and meteorological challenges unique to this particular stretch of ocean. Yet, the consistency with which this same region has continued to generate unusual losses across nearly 5 centuries, from colonial-era galleons to 20th-century aircraft and vessels, has ensured that purely conventional explanations have never fully satisfied public fascination with the area's reputation. Were these earliest disappearances simply the inevitable losses of an especially hazardous stretch of ocean, explainable entirely through storms, reefs, and navigational error common to the era? Or did colonial sailors, centuries before the term Bermuda Triangle was ever coined, encounter something within these waters that has continued, in one form or another, to claim ships and lives ever since? The ocean itself has kept whatever answer it holds, offering back only fragments of wreckage, incomplete reports, and a pattern of loss that has persisted for far longer than any single explanation has yet managed to fully account for. Tedworth House, in Wiltshire, England, was in 1661 the residence of a local magistrate named John Mompesson, a man whose name would become permanently attached to one of the most thoroughly documented cases of alleged supernatural disturbance in 17th century English history. What began as a minor legal dispute over a confiscated drum would evolve, over the following months, into a case investigated, witnessed, and recorded by figures of considerable social and intellectual standing, a case that continues to occupy an unusual position at the intersection of documented historical event and unresolved paranormal legend. The trouble began when Mompesson, in his capacity as a local magistrate, confiscated a drum from a traveling drummer named William Drury, who had been using the instrument to solicit money under what Mompesson considered false pretenses, claiming an official license he did not actually possess. Mompesson had the drum brought to his own home, and shortly afterward, Drury was separately arrested and imprisoned on unrelated charges. It was at this point, according to Mompesson's own account and numerous subsequent witnesses, that the disturbances began. Loud, rhythmic drumming sounds reportedly emanated from various parts of the house, seemingly without physical source, occurring most frequently at night and continuing for extended periods. Over the following months, the disturbances escalated considerably beyond drumming alone. Witnesses reported objects moving without visible cause, scratching sounds emanating from beds and furniture, unexplained knocking throughout the house, and, according to several accounts, physical disturbances directed specifically at Maupassant's children, including instances where their beds were reportedly lifted or shaken while they lay inside them. What separates the Tedworth case from countless other haunting accounts of the era is the sheer volume of documentation surrounding it, and the credibility of many who chose to investigate it directly. The case drew the attention of Joseph Glanville, a clergyman and prominent member of the newly established Royal Society, who visited Tedworth House personally, interviewed witnesses, and later published a detailed account of the disturbances in his work, Sadicismus Triumphatus. Treating the case with the same investigative rigor he might have applied to any natural philosophical inquiry of the period. Glanville's involvement lent the case unusual scientific credibility for its time, given his direct association with an institution increasingly committed to empirical observation and skepticism toward unverified claims. Even King Charles II took a personal interest in the matter, reportedly dispatching representatives to investigate the disturbances directly, given the case's growing public notoriety. According to some accounts, these royal investigators experienced a period of unusual quiet during their specific visit, an absence of activity that skeptics at the time seized upon as evidence the entire affair had been fabricated, timed conveniently to avoid detection during official scrutiny, while believers countered that the entities or forces responsible may simply have been more cautious in the presence of official observers, a pattern not entirely inconsistent with other reported cases of alleged haunting throughout history. The mainstream historical explanation, favored increasingly as skepticism toward supernatural phenomena grew during the Enlightenment and beyond, centers on deliberate fraud, quite possibly orchestrated in some capacity by Maupassant's own household staff, or even involving Maupassant himself, potentially motivated by a desire for public attention, sympathy, or, according to some later theories, an effort to discredit William Drury, further following their initial legal dispute over the confiscated drum. Under this theory, the drumming and subsequent disturbances were manufactured through concealed mechanisms, hidden accomplices, or simple, well-timed physical trickery, exploiting the genuine fear and superstition of the era to sustain a hoax capable of drawing attention from figures as prominent as members of the Royal Society and eventually the King's own court. This skeptical theory gained some support from later developments in the case. William Drury himself, following his release from imprisonment, was reportedly investigated on suspicion of witchcraft in connection with the disturbances, and, according to some accounts, appeared to accept credit for causing them during subsequent legal proceedings, though the reliability of these later confessions remains debated, given the coercive legal environment and considerable social pressure surrounding accusations of witchcraft during this period. Yet this explanation, while broadly accepted by modern skeptics, does not fully account for every recorded detail of the case. The sheer number of independent witnesses, including individuals with no clear motive to participate in or sustain an elaborate hoax, and the multi-month duration of disturbances reported consistently across numerous separate visits, complicate any simple explanation involving a single hidden mechanism or a small group of conspirators capable of maintaining such an elaborate deception undetected for so long, particularly under the scrutiny of trained observers like Glanville, who approached the case with explicit skepticism before ultimately concluding the phenomena defied any explanation he could identify through natural means. More speculative theories, largely confined to those already inclined toward belief in genuine supernatural phenomena, propose that the disturbances may represent an authentic case of what later investigators would categorize as poltergeist activity, a phenomenon some researchers have associated with unconscious psychological or even physiological factors within a household. particularly connected in certain modern theories to unresolved tension or stress among children present within an afflicted home, though this framework remains speculative and lacks the kind of rigorous, testable evidence that would satisfy contemporary scientific standards. Under this theory, whether or not any deliberate malevolent force was involved, the Mompesson household may have experienced something genuinely anomalous, its true nature simply beyond the investigative tools available in the 17th century, and arguably beyond those available even today. What remains is this: a documented case, investigated by credible figures of considerable social standing, producing an account that has survived for over 3.5 centuries without ever being definitively resolved as either confirmed fraud or genuine unexplained phenomena. Glanville himself, despite his clear scientific inclinations and initial skepticism, ultimately concluded he could find no satisfactory natural explanation for what he had personally witnessed and documented. Was the phantom drummer of Tedworth an elaborate deception, sustained through cunning and opportunity by those with a grudge to settle? Or did John Mompesson's household experience something that has never been adequately explained by rational investigation, then or since? The drum itself has long since disappeared from the historical record, but the sound it apparently left behind, at least according to those who swore they heard it, continues to echo, unresolved, through nearly 4 centuries of English folklore and formal historical inquiry alike. The mouth of the Kennebec River, where it empties into the Atlantic along the coast of present-day Maine, is a rugged, windswept landscape of rocky shoreline and dense forest, offering little immediate indication that it was once the site of one of England's earliest colonial settlements in North America, a colony that, unlike its more famous southern counterpart at Jamestown, has been largely overlooked by popular history, despite raising questions about its abandonment that remain, in certain respects, unresolved even today. In August 1607, roughly 120 English colonists arrived at this location under the sponsorship of the Plymouth Company, establishing Fort St. George, more commonly known to history as the Popham Colony, named after Sir John Popham, one of its principal backers. The timing placed it remarkably close to Jamestown's own founding just months earlier, positioning Popham as one of 2 simultaneous English attempts to establish a permanent foothold in North America. Unlike Jamestown, however, Popham would not survive its first year. The colonists constructed a substantial fort, complete with storehouses, a chapel, and residential structures, and even built and launched the Virginia, a small ship that holds the distinction of being the first ocean-going vessel constructed by English colonists in the Americas, a genuine and well-documented achievement, and one that demonstrates the colony was hardly a haphazard or poorly organized venture in its early months. Relations with local Abenaki communities began cordially enough, involving early trade, though tensions gradually increased as the colonists' presence continued and resources grew strained heading into the region's harsh winter. By the following autumn, less than 14 months after their arrival, the surviving colonists abandoned the settlement entirely and returned to England. The mainstream historical explanation for this abandonment cites a combination of factors that, taken together, present a reasonably coherent picture. An unusually severe winter that strained supplies and morale considerably beyond what the colonists had anticipated. The death of colony president George Popham during that winter, removing key leadership at a critical moment, and news arriving from England of the death of Sir John Popham himself, one of the colony's principal financial backers, along with reports suggesting Sir Francis Popham, his heir, showed considerably less enthusiasm for continuing to fund the venture. This explanation, grounded firmly in documented correspondence and financial records, accounts reasonably well for the colony's abandonment as an economic and logistical failure rather than a mysterious disappearance in the tradition of Roanoke. Unlike that earlier, more famous case, the Popham colonists did not vanish. They returned to England as a group, their fate documented, their voices recorded in surviving letters and reports. And yet, questions persist regarding the colony's final months that historians have never fully resolved, particularly concerning the true extent of deteriorating relations with local Abenaki communities, and whether tensions played a more significant role in the decision to abandon the settlement than the primarily economic narrative typically emphasized in mainstream accounts. Some surviving correspondence from colonists hints at growing unease regarding relations with nearby indigenous communities during the colony's final months, suggesting incidents of friction or distrust that go largely unelaborated in the documentation that has survived. Was the harsh winter and loss of financial backing truly sufficient on its own to prompt complete abandonment after little more than a year, particularly when Jamestown, facing comparably severe hardship and far higher mortality rates during the same period, chose to persist rather than abandon its settlement entirely? Some historians have wondered whether additional pressures, perhaps involving deteriorating relations with Abenaki communities, to a degree not fully preserved in the surviving record, may have weighed more heavily on the colonists' final decision than economic considerations alone. Archaeological work conducted in recent decades, particularly excavations beginning in the 1990s that successfully located and confirmed the fort's original site along the Kennebec, has added valuable physical evidence to the historical record, recovering artifacts that corroborate much of what documentary sources describe regarding the fort's construction and daily colonial life. However, these excavations have yet to fully resolve the more ambiguous questions surrounding the colony's final months, and no archaeological evidence has emerged suggesting violence or conflict severe enough to independently explain the abandonment, tending to support the primarily economic and logistical narrative favored by mainstream historians, even as some questions about the full nature of the colonists' final relationship with the region's original inhabitants remain difficult to answer definitively from the archaeological record alone. More speculative theories, generally given limited credence within mainstream historical scholarship, have occasionally suggested the colony's rapid abandonment may reflect encounters or circumstances beyond what surviving documentation fully describes, ranging from exaggerated claims of unexplained phenomena reported by a small number of 19th-century writers revisiting the story for popular audiences, to broader suggestions that the true depth of tension with Abenaki communities was deliberately minimized in official reports to avoid discouraging future colonial investment in the region, given how heavily the Plymouth Company's future ventures depended on maintaining an optimistic narrative regarding relations with indigenous populations along the northeastern coast. What remains undisputed is the physical legacy Popham left behind. The confirmed location of Fort St. George, meticulously excavated and studied in recent decades, and the genuine historical significance of the Virginia, whose successful construction and voyage back across the Atlantic demonstrated colonial shipbuilding capability far earlier than most historical narratives typically acknowledge. Yet the full, complete story of exactly why over 120 colonists chose complete abandonment rather than the perseverance shown by their counterparts at Jamestown during a similarly difficult first year continues to invite historians to look beyond the primary economic narrative toward a more complete accounting of the colony's final, quietly documented months. Was Popham simply a colonial venture whose funding collapsed at precisely the wrong moment, its abandonment a straightforward matter of economics and unfortunate timing? Or did the colonists carry back to England a fuller account of hardship and conflict than official records were ever willing to fully preserve? The fort's rediscovered foundations offer artifacts, but not motive, leaving the question of Popham's true complete story only partially answered by the ground that has, at last, given up its location, if not the whole of what happened there. The Silver Shoals, a treacherous stretch of shallow reefs north of Hispaniola in the Caribbean, appear on modern navigational charts as a hazard to be avoided. A scattered maze of coral and sandbar lying just beneath the surface of otherwise open water. Yet it was here, in the autumn of 1641, that one of the largest and most consequential shipwrecks in the history of Spanish transatlantic trade occurred, scattering a fortune in silver, gold, and other cargo across the seafloor, a portion of which remains unaccounted for to this day. The ship at the center of this mystery was the Nuestra Señora de la Concepción, the flagship of that year's Spanish treasure fleet, tasked with transporting an extraordinary quantity of silver and other valuable cargo from the colonies back to Spain. The fleet's departure had already been delayed considerably beyond its intended schedule, a decision driven by economic pressure from the Spanish crown, which depended heavily on colonial silver shipments to fund its ongoing military and political obligations throughout Europe. This delay pushed the fleet's Atlantic crossing directly into hurricane season, a risk Spanish officials were reportedly aware of, but chose to accept given the Crown's urgent need for the silver's arrival. The gamble proved catastrophic. The fleet encountered a severe hurricane shortly after departure, scattering its ships and causing significant damage throughout. The Concepcion itself survived the initial storm, though badly damaged, its rudder destroyed and its hull compromised. Rather than making for the nearest safe harbor, the ship's officers, after considerable and reportedly contentious debate among themselves, elected to attempt a return toward Puerto Rico for repairs, navigating without a fully functional rudder through waters that included the poorly charted Silver Shoals. The decision proved fatal. The Concepcion struck the reef, became lodged fast among the coral formations, and after a prolonged period during which the crew attempted salvage and construction of makeshift vessels to escape, the ship was ultimately abandoned to the sea, its cargo of silver, along with substantial additional wealth carried informally by passengers and crew beyond the ship's official manifest, sinking into the shallow waters of the shoals. This much is well documented, supported by Spanish colonial records, survivor testimony, and subsequent salvage attempts conducted not long after the wreck itself. Indeed, the Spanish crown, desperate to recover as much of the lost silver as possible, organized salvage expeditions almost immediately, recovering a meaningful portion of the treasure in the years following the wreck. This alone distinguishes the Concepcion from many other lost treasure legends. A considerable amount of what went down with the ship was, in fact, recovered relatively soon afterward through documented and verified salvage operations. But not all of it. Official Spanish records from the era's salvage attempts indicate that despite considerable effort, a significant portion of the ship's cargo remained unrecovered, lost among the shifting sands and coral formations of the Silver Shoals, an area difficult to navigate and search thoroughly using the diving and salvage technology available in the 17th century. Over the following decades, additional salvage attempts, including notably one led by the English privateer William Phips in 1687, successfully recovered further portions of the treasure. An expedition significant enough to earn Phips a knighthood and considerable personal wealth upon his return to England. Phipps's success demonstrated conclusively that substantial treasure remained on the site decades after the original wreck, adding considerable weight to persistent beliefs that a further, uncounted portion may still remain unaccounted for even after his efforts. This raises the central and enduring question surrounding the Concepcion. How much of the original cargo has truly been recovered across the centuries of salvage attempts that followed, and how much, if any, might still remain hidden among the shifting sands of the Silver Shoals? The mainstream historical view holds that, between Spanish colonial-era salvage efforts, Phipps's 17th century expedition, and additional recovery operations conducted throughout the 20th century by modern treasure hunting companies using considerably more advanced technology, The overwhelming majority of recoverable treasure from the Concepcion has likely already been located and removed. Under this view, whatever silver or gold may technically remain scattered across the reef likely exists in small, dispersed quantities, buried beneath the centuries of shifting sand and coral growth, rather than as any significant, concentrated fortune awaiting discovery. Yet, this conclusion has never fully satisfied treasure hunters and historians who point to the sheer scale of the original cargo manifest, along with persistent uncertainty regarding exactly how much unofficial, undeclared wealth may have been carried aboard the ship by passengers and crew seeking to avoid Spanish taxation on personal shipments, a common and well-documented practice throughout the era of Spanish colonial trade. If a substantial portion of the ship's true wealth was never formally recorded in the first place, precisely how could any modern accounting definitively confirm how much has, or has not, ultimately been recovered? This uncertainty has fueled continued search efforts well into the modern era. In the 1970s, an American treasure hunting expedition led by Bert Weber conducted extensive searches of the Silver Shoals region, eventually locating what is widely believed to be the actual wreck site of the Concepcion, and recovering a substantial quantity of additional silver, ceramics, and other artifacts. Findings that received considerable attention within the treasure hunting and archaeological communities alike. Weber's expedition, while celebrated as one of the more successful and well-documented modern treasure recoveries, still left open the question of whether the full site had been thoroughly explored, given the shifting nature of the reef's sands and the sheer difficulty of conducting exhaustive searches across such a wide and treacherous underwater area. More speculative theories have emerged over the decades as well, including suggestions that the Concepcion's true cargo manifest may have significantly understated its actual wealth, given the Spanish crown's well-documented history of taxation evasion among colonial merchants and officials eager to protect personal fortunes from formal declaration. Under this theory, the ship may have carried considerably more wealth than any official record, salvage account, or modern recovery has ever fully accounted for, leaving open the possibility that a genuinely significant fortune remains scattered somewhere across the shoals, beyond what even Weber's relatively successful 20th century expedition was able to locate. Other, more fringe theories propose that portions of the treasure may have been quietly removed by earlier, undocumented salvage attempts conducted by local fishermen or opportunistic sailors in the decades between the wreck and Phipps's official 1687 expedition, operating outside of Spanish colonial oversight, and therefore leaving no official record of their activities. Under this theory, an unknown and likely unquantifiable portion of the Concepcion's original cargo may have entered private hands centuries ago, dispersed quietly into local economies and family fortunes long before any formal historical accounting could ever hope to track it. What remains undisputed is the extraordinary scale of wealth genuinely lost when the Concepcion struck the Silver Shoals in 1641, a fortune substantial enough to warrant repeated salvage attempts across more than 3 centuries, each producing genuine and verifiable recoveries, yet none definitively confirming the site has been fully and completely exhausted of everything it once held. The reef itself, shifting continuously under wind and current, has a documented habit of concealing and later revealing artifacts across different survey periods, meaning even thoroughly searched sections of the wreck site could plausibly yield further discoveries decades after being considered fully explored. Modern underwater archaeology, employing considerably more sophisticated sonar and excavation technology than any previous expedition, continues to show occasional interest in revisiting the Silver Shoals, though the area's remote location and challenging conditions have limited the frequency and scale of contemporary searches compared to the more accessible wreck sites elsewhere in the Caribbean. Was the Concepcion's fortune substantially recovered centuries ago, its remaining scattered fragments now permanently and irretrievably lost beneath shifting sand, rather than concentrated in any meaningful, recoverable quantity? Or does a genuinely significant portion of one of Spanish colonial history's greatest maritime disasters remain exactly where the ship left it in 1641, waiting beneath waters that have already proven, through centuries of intermittent recovery, that they have not yet finished revealing everything they hold? The silver shoals keep shifting, and with them, the true, final answer to how much the sea has truly kept for itself. The Concepcion's fortune, at least, is known to exist somewhere beneath the silver shoals, even if its exact resting place remains contested. 4 centuries earlier, and an ocean away, another royal fortune disappeared just as completely, not into the deep, but into the shifting mudflats of the English coastline, swallowed by a tide that gave England's most notorious king almost no warning at all. The Wash, a large, shallow tidal estuary along the coast of eastern England, appears today as an unremarkable expanse of mudflats and marshland, its waters retreating and returning with the tides much as they have for thousands of years. Yet somewhere beneath its shifting sands, according to one of English history's most persistent legends, lies a portion of the crown jewels of King John, the same king remembered for signing the Magna Carta under pressure from rebellious barons, and whose reign ended, according to near-contemporary chronicles, in a disaster involving his own baggage train. In October 1216, King John, engaged in ongoing civil war against a coalition of barons, was traveling along the eastern English coast with his royal household, army, and a substantial baggage train reportedly containing the crown jewels, along with coin, plate, and other valuables. According to the traditional account, John's party opted to cross the Wash via a known shortcut, a route passable only at low tide, while the king and his immediate escort made the crossing successfully. The tide reportedly turned with unusual speed, catching the heavier, slower-moving baggage train still on the crossing. Wagons became mired in what had turned to quicksand, and the rising water is said to have overwhelmed the train entirely, sweeping the jewels, coin, and provisions into the estuary. John himself fell seriously ill shortly afterward and died within days, adding a grim postscript to an already disastrous journey. This is the version of events recorded, with variations, by several near-contemporary chroniclers, and it has endured for over 8 centuries as one of England's most famous stories of sudden, catastrophic loss. But how much of it actually happened as described? Modern historians remain divided, and the uncertainty begins with the sources themselves. The most detailed contemporary accounts were written by chroniclers with little direct affection for John, a deeply unpopular king remembered by many of his era as tyrannical, raising the possibility that later details may have been exaggerated or dramatized to suit a narrative of divine punishment befalling a disgraced monarch. Some historians have proposed a more mundane, if less dramatic, explanation, that a portion of the treasure may never have been lost in the Wash at all, but was instead quietly misappropriated, sold, or redistributed by members of John's own household or court in the chaos surrounding his final illness and death, with the story of a tidal disaster serving as a convenient explanation that required no accounting to the incoming regency government of John's young son, Henry III. Astronomical research conducted in recent years has lent unexpected credibility to at least part of the traditional account. Using modern calculations of lunar position and tidal behavior, researchers have determined that an unusually powerful tidal event, a perigean spring tide, caused by a rare alignment of the sun and moon combined with the moon's closest approach to Earth, did occur in the Wash on the exact date the baggage train is traditionally said to have crossed, with tidal ranges reportedly reaching over 20 feet. This finding suggests that whatever happened to John's baggage train, the physical conditions described in the old chronicles were, at minimum, entirely plausible for that specific day rather than pure invention. Yet plausibility is not proof. No conclusive physical evidence of the lost treasure has ever been recovered from the wash, despite centuries of intermittent searching and, more recently, several targeted archaeological investigations. Excavations conducted in the surrounding area in 2016 and again in 2024, prompted in the latter case by construction work near Walpole Marsh, uncovered minor artifacts but no gold, jewels, or definitive evidence of the treasure itself. Some researchers have suggested that if any treasure genuinely was lost in the estuary, centuries of shifting sediment, changing coastlines, and the sheer scale of the search area may have buried it far beyond what current archaeological techniques can practically locate. A landscape that has changed considerably since the 13th century, potentially placing the true site of the disaster well inland from where the modern wash's boundaries now lie. Other researchers have pursued an entirely different theory, proposing that the treasure was never lost through natural disaster at all, but was deliberately diverted by a small group of nobles and officials close to John in his final weeks, exploiting the chaos of his declining health and the political uncertainty surrounding the succession to quietly redirect a significant portion of the crown's wealth for their own purposes. Under this theory, the story of a disastrous tidal crossing may have originated, or at least been deliberately amplified, as a convenient cover for what was, in reality, a calculated act of theft carried out by men close enough to the king to arrange it without immediate detection. This theory draws some support from the historical aftermath. Despite the supposed loss of an enormous quantity of royal wealth, including coin estimates that would have represented a substantial portion of the crown's available treasury, the transition of power to the young Henry III and his regency government does not appear, based on surviving financial records, to have suffered the kind of prolonged fiscal crisis one might expect following the loss of such an extraordinary sum. Some historians have interpreted this relative financial stability as evidence that the losses may have been considerably smaller than the more dramatic chronicle accounts suggest, or that a significant portion of the lost treasure was, in fact, recovered, redirected, or never actually placed at risk in the crossing to begin with. There is also the matter of what, precisely, was lost. Detailed surviving inventories indicate John possessed an extensive collection of regalia, jewels, and plate, including items inherited from his grandmother, the Empress Matilda, along with gifts received from senior clergy and even the Pope himself. Yet records from Henry III's own coronation in 1220 list regalia, including a crown, sword, and scepter, that appear consistent with items belonging to his father, suggesting that at least some of John's most significant royal regalia survived the crossing entirely intact, and was simply passed down rather than lost. This detail complicates the traditional narrative considerably. If the most important pieces of regalia demonstrably survived, precisely what was lost in the wash, and how much of it, remains far less certain than the enduring legend typically suggests. What remains undisputed is that something happened along that stretch of coastline in October 1216, in the final days of an already disastrous reign, and that whatever occurred has never been fully or conclusively resolved by any subsequent investigation, historical or archaeological. The wash itself continues to shift, its mudflats and channels changing gradually with each passing tide, offering occasional new fragments to searchers while withholding, so far, any definitive answer. Did King John genuinely lose a substantial portion of England's crown jewels to a freak tidal disaster, exactly as chroniclers hostile to his memory described? Or does the true story lie closer to the royal court itself, among men who understood precisely how convenient a natural disaster could be as cover for opportunity seized during a dying king's final chaotic days? 8 centuries later, the wash's tides continue their patient work, concealing whatever truth, if any, still lies beneath them. The Catherine Palace, in Tsarskoye Selo, just outside St. Petersburg, is a sprawling Baroque masterpiece of Russian imperial architecture, its golden facade and elaborate interiors reflecting centuries of wealth and craftsmanship. Within its walls once stood one of the most extraordinary decorative chambers ever constructed, a room whose walls, panels, and ornamentation were crafted almost entirely from amber, backed with gold leaf and mirrors, and prized as one of the great artistic treasures of 18th century Europe. Today, that original room no longer exists in its authentic form, and its true, complete fate remains one of the enduring mysteries to emerge from the Second World War. The Amber Room's origins trace back to Prussia, where its earliest sections were designed and crafted in the early 18th century under the patronage of King Frederick I. The room was later gifted to Tsar Peter the Great in 1716, as part of a broader diplomatic alliance between Prussia and Russia, and was subsequently expanded and installed within the Catherine Palace, where it became one of the most celebrated rooms in the Russian imperial residence. Marveled at by visitors for its warm, glowing amber panels and intricate craftsmanship, valued even in its own era at a sum considered almost incalculable given the rarity of amber itself as a decorative material at that scale. This much is well documented through surviving correspondence, diplomatic records, and detailed contemporary descriptions and illustrations created before the room's eventual disappearance. The earliest plans and designs for the room, originating in Prussia before its gift to Russia, establish clearly that this was never a single, spontaneous creation, but a carefully planned and evolving work, modified and expanded over decades by multiple craftsmen and patrons across two of Europe's most powerful royal courts. The mystery, however, begins not with the room's creation, but with its disappearance during the Second World War. In 1941, as German forces advanced into Soviet territory during Operation Barbarossa, Soviet officials at the Catherine Palace attempted to protect the Amber Room, initially believing the delicate amber panels too fragile to safely dismantle and evacuate. This decision would prove catastrophic. When German forces occupied the palace, specialized personnel dismantled the room themselves, packing its panels into crates and transporting them to Königsberg in East Prussia, where the room was reassembled and displayed within Königsberg Castle for several years, a decision framed by German officials at the time as a symbolic reclamation of a treasure with genuine Prussian origins. This is where verifiable historical documentation becomes considerably more fragmented. As Soviet forces advanced toward Königsberg in 1945, the castle was heavily damaged by Allied bombing and subsequent fighting, and the Amber Room, still housed within its walls at the time, disappeared from any further definitive historical record. Some accounts suggest the room may have been destroyed entirely in the fires and destruction that consumed much of Königsberg Castle during this period. Others maintain that German officials, anticipating the city's fall, had the room's panels crated once again and evacuated to a secondary location shortly before the final Soviet assault, though no fully corroborated evidence has ever conclusively confirmed such a transfer took place, nor definitively identified where such a relocation might have led. For decades following the war, Soviet and later Russian investigators, alongside independent researchers and treasure hunters from multiple countries, pursued numerous leads regarding the room's possible survival and hidden location. Some theories have focused on the extensive network of underground bunkers, tunnels, and mines constructed throughout the Königsberg region during the war's final years, structures that German forces used extensively to shelter valuable cultural property from Allied bombing, some of which remain incompletely mapped or explored even today, given the political and logistical complications of conducting extensive searches within what is now Kaliningrad, a Russian exclave with restricted access to many former military sites. Other researchers have proposed the panels may have been loaded onto one of several German vessels that departed the Baltic coast in the war's final chaotic weeks, potentially including ships that were subsequently sunk by Soviet submarines during the evacuation of German civilians and military personnel from East Prussia, an era that saw some of the deadliest maritime disasters in history, with several vessels lost carrying both military cargo and civilian refugees. If the Amber Room's panels were indeed aboard one of these ships, they would now rest somewhere on the floor of the Baltic Sea, their precise location dependent entirely on which vessel, among several candidates proposed by different researchers, actually carried them. This uncertainty regarding the room's final wartime movements has fueled an unusually persistent search effort, spanning more than 7 decades. Numerous expeditions, funded by governments, private investors, and dedicated amateur researchers, have pursued leads throughout the Kaliningrad region and along the Baltic coastline, occasionally generating considerable media attention when preliminary findings suggested a possible breakthrough, though none have yet produced definitive physical evidence of the original room's surviving panels. Compounding the difficulty of any modern search is the sheer scale of wartime destruction and subsequent Soviet-era redevelopment throughout the region, which has altered much of the original wartime landscape considerably. Structures that once stood have been demolished, rebuilt, or repurposed, and entire sections of Königsberg's historical urban geography have been transformed under decades of Soviet administration, complicating efforts to correlate wartime records and testimony with the modern physical landscape of Kaliningrad as it exists today. Beyond these primary theories, more speculative possibilities have circulated for decades as well. Some researchers have suggested individual panels, rather than the room in its complete form, may have been separated, looted, or sold individually amid the chaos of the war's final collapse, potentially scattering fragments of the original room into private collections across multiple countries, where they might exist today without their true origin or significance ever being recognized by current owners. This theory gained unexpected, though limited, support in the 1990s and 2000s, when a small number of individual items, including a stone mosaic panel and an ornate chest, both verified as authentic components of the original room, surfaced independently in Germany, recovered under circumstances suggesting they had been taken as personal souvenirs by individual soldiers during the room's dismantling, rather than transported as part of any larger coordinated wartime movement. These isolated recoveries, while significant in confirming that at least some original material did survive the war in private hands, have done little to resolve the far larger question of what became of the majority of the room's panels and ornamentation, and whether any substantial portion might still exist intact somewhere, rather than having been destroyed, dispersed into unrecognized fragments, or lost to the Baltic seafloor entirely. Russian authorities, working from detailed pre-war photographs and surviving craftsmen's knowledge, ultimately undertook a painstaking reconstruction of the Amber Room within the Catherine Palace, a project spanning over 2 decades and completed in 2003, resulting in a meticulously recreated version of the original that today allows visitors to experience something closely approximating its historical appearance, even as the fate of the authentic 18th century panels themselves remains formally unresolved. This reconstruction, while widely praised for its craftsmanship and historical accuracy, has in some respects only deepened public fascination with the original's fate, offering a vivid, tangible sense of what was lost while doing nothing to answer where, precisely, the genuine article ultimately ended up. Modern researchers continue to debate which combination of destruction, hidden survival, or scattered private possession most likely accounts for the room's true fate, without any single theory having yet achieved definitive confirmation through physical evidence. What remains certain is this: a room whose earliest plans originated in Prussia, gifted to Russia as a symbol of diplomatic alliance, admired for over 2 centuries, as one of Europe's most remarkable decorative treasures, vanished amid the collapse of the very region where it had first been conceived, its final movements obscured by the same wartime chaos that claimed so much else across Europe during those final catastrophic months of conflict. Did the Amber Room burn within the ruins of Königsberg Castle, its amber panels reduced to ash, alongside so much else lost in that final devastating siege? Did it sink somewhere beneath the Baltic Sea, sealed within the hull of a ship that never reached its destination? Or does some substantial portion of it remain intact even now, hidden within a forgotten bunker, or scattered quietly among private collections whose owners have never fully understood what they truly possess? Nearly 80 years after its disappearance, the question posed by those earliest Prussian plans of a room conceived, crafted, and admired across two empires remains answered only by its reconstruction, and by a search that, despite decades of effort, has never yet located the amber itself. Perleberg, a small town in what was then Prussia, appears in most historical records as an unremarkable waypoint along a well-traveled route between Berlin and the German coast. Yet, on the evening of November 25, 1809, this quiet town became the setting for one of the most puzzling disappearances of the Napoleonic era: the vanishing of Benjamin Bathurst, a British diplomat whose disappearance has never been definitively explained, despite investigations conducted at the time by British, Prussian, and even French authorities. Bathurst was, at just 25 years old, already an experienced diplomat, serving as Britain's envoy to the Austrian court during a period of intense conflict with Napoleonic France. Having completed a sensitive diplomatic mission attempting to secure Austrian support against Napoleon, Bathurst was traveling home to England, journeying incognito under an assumed identity to avoid detection by French agents or sympathizers who might have targeted a known British diplomat crossing hostile territory during wartime. According to witness accounts gathered shortly afterward, Bathurst arrived at an inn in Perleberg in the early evening, appearing visibly anxious and unsettled. He reportedly requested horses to continue his journey immediately, and while these were being arranged, he stepped outside to inspect the change of horses at his carriage, walking around to the far side of the vehicle, away from his secretary and other members of his traveling party who remained nearby. He was never seen again. The disappearance triggered an immediate and thorough search. Bathurst's own traveling companions raised the alarm quickly, and local Prussian authorities conducted searches of the inn, the surrounding town, and the immediate countryside, finding no trace of him. In the weeks that followed, additional investigations were launched, involving British diplomatic pressure on Prussian officials and, notably, formal inquiries directed even toward French authorities, given Napoleon's forces' significant influence over the region at the time. The French government publicly and firmly denied any involvement, a denial that has never been definitively proven false, though it has also never been entirely accepted by historians as the final word on the matter. This much is well documented through official correspondence, contemporary newspaper accounts, and the recorded testimony of those present that evening. What happened next, however, moves increasingly into uncertain territory. The most straightforward historical explanation holds that Bathurst was the victim of a targeted assassination or abduction carried out by French agents, or by individuals sympathetic to Napoleon's cause, aware of his diplomatic mission and status despite his attempts to travel incognito. Under this theory, his disappearance was a deliberate act of wartime espionage, and his body, disposed of quickly and discreetly, was simply never recovered amid the chaos and divided loyalties of a region under significant French influence. Bathurst's own behavior in his final hours lends some support to this theory. Witnesses at the inn described him as unusually nervous, and he had reportedly requested armed protection from a local official shortly before his disappearance, suggesting he may have believed himself to be in genuine danger, whether from surveillance, pursuit, or a more direct threat he had reason to fear specifically in Perleberg. Yet, other historians have proposed a considerably more mundane explanation: that Bathurst, worn down by the stress of his diplomatic mission and the psychological strain of extended travel under a false identity through hostile territory, may have suffered a mental breakdown, wandering off on his own initiative rather than falling victim to any external act of violence. Under this theory, his death, whenever and however it occurred, resulted from misadventure, exposure, or personal crisis rather than deliberate abduction, with his disappearance simply going unwitnessed due to the darkness and general confusion of an ordinary evening in courtyard rather than any coordinated plot. Complicating any confident conclusion is a discovery made decades later, in 1852, when a skeleton was uncovered beneath the floorboards of a house in Perleberg that had, at the time of Bathurst's disappearance, belonged to a man employed as a waiter at the very inn where Bathurst had last been seen. The skull associated with these remains reportedly showed clear signs of violent trauma, consistent with a deliberate killing rather than accidental death or natural causes. Yet the identity of these remains was never conclusively established through any means available at the time, and no definitive forensic connection to Bathurst himself was ever confirmed, leaving open the tantalizing but ultimately unresolved possibility that this discovery represented, at last, physical evidence of his fate, or, alternatively, evidence of an entirely unrelated crime that happened to share the same physical setting purely by coincidence. Some researchers have proposed a version of events combining elements of both primary theories: that Bathurst, already anxious and possibly aware of specific danger, was targeted deliberately that evening by individuals operating within or connected to the inn itself, individuals with financial or political motive to eliminate a fleeing British diplomat quietly, disposing of his body in a manner deliberately intended to avoid detection during the initial searches conducted immediately after his disappearance. If accurate, this theory would suggest the 1852 discovery may indeed represent Bathurst's actual remains, hidden for over 4 decades beneath the floor of a residence connected to someone present at the inn on the night in question. Still more speculative theories, generally given limited credence among historians, have proposed additional possibilities over the decades, including suggestions that Bathurst may have deliberately staged his own disappearance for reasons connected to his diplomatic work, perhaps to escape further exposure to danger by adopting an entirely new identity, or that information he carried regarding Austrian diplomatic negotiations made him a target not of French agents specifically, but of other competing intelligence interests operating throughout the region during this particularly volatile period of the Napoleonic Wars. What remains undisputed is the sequence of documented events themselves. A British diplomat, traveling incognito through hostile territory on a sensitive wartime mission, arrived visibly anxious at an inn, requested urgent onward travel, stepped briefly out of sight of his own traveling party, and vanished entirely, triggering searches and formal diplomatic inquiries that produced no conclusive resolution either at the time or in the more than 2 centuries since. The 1852 discovery of violently damaged remains beneath a house connected to that same inn adds a genuinely unsettling data point to the case, without ever providing the kind of definitive identification needed to close it. Was Benjamin Bathurst the victim of a calculated wartime assassination, silenced before he could complete his journey home with whatever knowledge or diplomatic secrets he carried? Did the pressures of his mission simply overwhelm him, leading to a private tragedy witnessed by no one? Or does that skull, uncovered decades later beneath a stranger's floorboards, hold the actual answer to a question that British, Prussian, and French investigators alike were never able to resolve at the time it mattered most? Perleberg's inn courtyard has long since faded into the ordinary rhythms of a quiet German town, its cobblestones offering no further evidence beyond what was recorded that November evening in 1809, leaving Bathurst's fate exactly where it has remained for over 2 centuries, unaccounted for and unresolved. Good news, this one checks out. The 1855 Devon event is real and well documented, and there genuinely are earlier precursor accounts of similar unexplained tracks. An 1840 report of mysterious prints in the snow near Glenorchy, Scotland, and a long-standing Russian/Polish folk tradition of hoof marks appearing annually on a hillside. Here's the piece, built on those verified precursors. Bathurst's disappearance left behind an inn courtyard and a question that outlived every investigator who tried to answer it. Our next mystery leaves no missing person at all, only marks left behind in snow, and a pattern of similar sightings that, contrary to popular retellings, did not begin in Devon in 1855, but had already been quietly reported and quietly dismissed more than a decade earlier. The Estuary in East and South Devon is today a wide, tranquil stretch of water bordered by quiet coastal towns, Topsham, Lympstone, Exmouth, the kind of gentle English landscape that seems entirely unsuited to the kind of story that made it famous for a few unsettling weeks in the winter of 1855. After a heavy overnight snowfall on February 8th and 9th, residents across more than 30 towns and villages awoke to find trails of small, hoof-like marks stamped into the fresh snow, running in an uninterrupted single line for what witnesses described as anywhere between 40 and 100 miles, passing directly over houses, haystacks, and walls as high as 14 feet, without disturbing the snow along the way. The marks became known almost immediately as the Devil's Footprints, and the resulting panic was significant enough that, according to contemporary newspaper accounts, some residents refused to leave their homes after dark for weeks, even months afterward. Clergy addressed the phenomenon directly from the pulpit, and the story spread rapidly from local papers to national publications like The Times and the Illustrated London News, eventually reaching readers as far away as Australia. This much is well documented, supported by numerous surviving letters, newspaper reports, and later scholarly compilations of the original source material. But the Devon footprints of 1855, however dramatic, were not in fact the first time such a phenomenon had been reported in the historical record, and this is where the story grows considerably more layered. 15 years earlier, in March 1840, The Times published an account of remarkably similar tracks discovered in the snow across a stretch of the Scottish Highlands, in the mountainous area where the districts of Glenorchy, Glenlyon, and Glen O'Shea meet. According to this earlier report, unusual footprints, again resembling the tracks of an animal moving through impossible or restrictive terrain, had appeared repeatedly across at least 2 successive winters in the region, drawing local curiosity and concern well before Devon's own encounter with the phenomenon made national headlines. This Scottish precursor received nowhere near the attention the Devon case would later generate, and it remained a relatively obscure regional curiosity until later, researchers examining the Devon case uncovered the earlier report and recognized the striking similarity between the two. Beyond Britain entirely, an even older tradition appears to describe something comparable. Contemporary 1855 accounts, drawing on reports circulating at the time, referenced a persistent local belief in parts of Russian Poland that hoof marks appeared annually along a particular hillside, manifesting in snow during winter and in the exposed sandy soil beneath it when no snow had fallen. Local residents in this region were said to have long attributed the marks to supernatural influence, treating them as an expected, recurring feature of the landscape rather than a singular, unexplained event, suggesting this type of phenomenon, whatever its true cause, may have held a place in regional folklore for considerably longer than any single documented instance can confirm. What connects the Devon case to these earlier reports is not certainty, but pattern. The recurring image of a trail that behaves in ways inconsistent with any known animal's natural gait, appearing after snowfall, provoking fear rooted in long-standing cultural associations between cloven markings and the presence of the devil, associations that stretch back through centuries of European folklore regarding demonic or supernatural beings said to bear a goat-like or hoofed appearance. The mainstream historical explanation for the Devon case, and by extension for these earlier similar reports, leans heavily toward a combination of mundane, natural causes compounded by the distorting effects of rumor and sensationalized press coverage. Naturalists at the time, including the prominent scientist Richard Owen, proposed that the marks may have originated from ordinary animals. Badgers, notably, given their nocturnal habits and unusual plantigrade gait, which can leave impressions considerably larger and stranger-looking than their size would suggest. Others pointed to donkeys, whose hoofprints closely match the size and shape described in numerous contemporary accounts, particularly in more rural, open sections of the reported trail. A more specific and frequently cited theory, first proposed in the 1930s by novelist Geoffrey Household, suggested that an experimental Royal Navy balloon, launched from nearby Devonport dockyard and accidentally released from its moorings, may have drifted across the county overnight, dragging loose mooring shackles behind it through the snow, creating a long, continuous trail capable of crossing walls, rooftops, and other obstacles that would have stopped any ordinary animal in its path. This theory, while intuitively appealing, given its ability to explain the trail's remarkable ability to bypass physical obstructions, has never been corroborated by any surviving Admiralty or dockyard record confirming such an incident occurred, leaving it, like so much else in this case, plausible but ultimately unproven. Still, other researchers examining the sheer volume of separate, sometimes contradictory eyewitness accounts collected across dozens of different Devon parishes have proposed that no single explanation accounts for the entire phenomenon at all, that the Devil's footprints of 1855 may represent not one continuous trail, but a patchwork of entirely unrelated animal tracks, hoaxes, and ordinary winter phenomena, subsequently woven together into a single dramatic narrative by a press eager for a sensational story, and by a frightened public primed by centuries of folklore to interpret ambiguous evidence through a supernatural lens. This theory gains considerable support from careful comparison of the surviving primary accounts, which show meaningful inconsistencies in the size, shape, and spacing of the reported prints from town to town. Inconsistencies that would be difficult to reconcile if a single entity, natural or otherwise, had genuinely traveled the entire reported distance in one continuous journey. Yet this same inconsistency cuts in the opposite direction as well. If ordinary animals, or a combination of separate innocuous causes, fully explain the Devon case, why do so strikingly similar reports appear independently in Scotland 15 years earlier, and within a persistent regional tradition in Poland describing what sounds, by contemporary description, remarkably similar to Devon's own experience? Coincidence remains entirely possible, particularly given how widespread cloven hoof imagery already was within European folklore long before 1855. But the recurrence of this very specific pattern, obstacle-defying trails, appearing suddenly in snow, provoking immediate supernatural interpretation, across separate regions and separate decades, has left some researchers wondering whether these precursor accounts represent independent instances of a genuinely shared, if still unidentified, natural phenomenon, one simply not yet fully understood or documented with the rigor available to modern science. What remains certain is that no conclusive, universally accepted explanation has ever been established for the Devon case itself, despite considerably more surviving documentation than exists for its earlier Scottish or Polish counterparts. The original prints and whatever specifically created them disappeared along with the snow that recorded them, leaving behind only second-hand letters, contested newspaper accounts, and sketches whose accuracy cannot now be independently verified. Were the Devil's Footprints of Devon merely the best documented instance of a rare but recurring natural phenomenon already glimpsed in Scotland decades earlier and long embedded in Eastern European folklore? Or did 1855 simply provide the right combination of heavy press coverage, religious anxiety, and genuine coincidence to transform a series of unrelated, ordinary occurrences into the most famous Devil's Trail in English history? The snow that carried the answer has long since melted, leaving behind only the accounts of those who saw it first, and the earlier, quieter reports that suggest Devon's mystery may never have been entirely alone. The Devil's Footprints left behind only a trail in melting snow, and questions that outlasted the season itself. Our next mystery unfolds somewhere far more intimate, inside a single farmhouse in the American frontier, where a family's torment would become one of the most enduring ghost stories in the United States, despite the strange fact that no one wrote any of it down until decades after it supposedly ended. The Red River winds through what is now Robertson County, Tennessee, a quiet stretch of farmland near the small town of Adams. Little remains today of the original Bell farmstead. The house itself has long since been torn down, but a cave on the property, added to the National Historical Register in 2008, still draws visitors curious about the events said to have unfolded there between 1817 and 1821. Events that would eventually become known across the American South as the legend of the Bell Witch. According to the traditional account, the haunting began in 1817, when farmer John Bell encountered a strange animal in his cornfield, described in some versions as having the body of a dog and the head of a rabbit. He fired at the creature and it vanished. In the weeks that followed, other family members reported their own unsettling encounters. An enormous, unfamiliar bird perched on a fence. A young girl in a green dress swinging from the branch of a tree. A black dog that silently escorted a family servant home one night before disappearing at the cabin door. Soon, the disturbances moved inside the house itself. Scratching sounds emerged from the bedposts. Chains seemed to drag across the floorboards. Bed covers were pulled away in the night, and family members, particularly the Bells' young daughter Betsy, reported being slapped and pinched by unseen hands, leaving marks that visitors and neighbors later described witnessing firsthand. The disturbances eventually escalated further, with the entity reportedly developing the ability to speak, engaging visitors in extended conversations, arguing theology with local ministers, and identifying itself, according to the most detailed later accounts, by the name Kate. The spirit is said to have made accurate predictions regarding future events, and to have expressed particular hostility toward John Bell himself, whose health deteriorated steadily throughout the ordeal until his death in 1820. A death some versions of the story attribute directly to the entity's influence, claiming he was poisoned by a mysterious vial of liquid discovered among his belongings after his passing. This is the story as most people encounter it today, but how much of it can actually be traced back to genuine contemporary documentation from the time it supposedly occurred? This is where the case becomes considerably more complicated for historians to assess with confidence. Despite occurring in the early 19th century, no known written account of the Bell Witch haunting exists from the actual period in which the events are said to have taken place. The first full-length published record, an authenticated history of the famous Bell Witch, did not appear until 1894, nearly 75 years after the haunting supposedly concluded, authored by newspaper editor Martin V. Ingram, who claimed to have based much of his account on a diary purportedly kept by Richard Williams Bell, one of John Bell's sons, along with interviews conducted with surviving family descendants and community members who recalled the story from childhood or from family tradition. This considerable gap between the alleged events and their first detailed written documentation raises significant questions for historians attempting to separate genuine 19th century experience from decades of oral retelling, embellishment, and potentially deliberate literary invention on Ingram's part. Some of the story's most memorable details, including the entity's specific identification as Kate, do not appear in any source predating Ingram's 1894 book, suggesting these elements may represent later additions rather than details genuinely originating from the family's own experience in the 1810s. Other frequently repeated elements of the legend, including a supposed visit from future President Andrew Jackson, whose carriage was said to have become mysteriously and inexplicably stuck near the Bell property, lack any corroborating historical documentation placing Jackson anywhere near the location during the relevant period, leading most historians to treat this particular detail as a later folkloric embellishment rather than genuine historical fact. Given these significant gaps in contemporary documentation, what explanations have historians and researchers proposed for whatever did occur at the Bell farmstead, stripped of its later literary elaboration? The most commonly proposed explanation centers on Betsy Bell herself, the family's young daughter who experienced the most severe and persistent physical disturbances throughout the haunting. Some researchers have suggested that Betsy, whether consciously or through psychological distress manifesting in physical symptoms, may have been responsible for producing at least some of the phenomena attributed to the entity, a pattern not entirely dissimilar from other historical poltergeist cases, in which disturbances have often centered disproportionately around a single adolescent member of an afflicted household. Under this theory, family tension, adolescent stress, or even a specific personal conflict. Some versions point to Betsy's troubled relationship with a suitor her father disapproved of, may have manifested as genuine, if unconsciously produced, disturbances that the family and community, operating within a worldview far more accepting of supernatural explanation than skepticism, interpreted as evidence of a malevolent spiritual presence. Other historians have proposed more skeptical explanations rooted in deliberate fraud, suggesting family members, community members, or some combination of both may have knowingly perpetuated an elaborate hoax, whether for personal amusement, communal storytelling tradition, or specific interpersonal motives tied to tensions within the Bell family itself, including unresolved land disputes and interpersonal conflicts documented, separately from the haunting narrative, within the broader historical record of the Bell family's presence in the Red River settlement. Regarding John Bell's death specifically, most historians favor considerably more mundane medical explanations than the poisoning narrative popularized by later retellings, suggesting his prolonged illness and eventual death likely resulted from a genuine, if undiagnosed, medical condition common to the era, with the supernatural interpretation layered on afterward as the surrounding legend continued to develop and elaborate upon the family's undeniable, if now difficult to verify, experience of prolonged distress. What makes the Bell Witch case genuinely difficult to resolve, however, is the near-universal agreement, even among skeptical modern historians, that something distressing did occur within the Bell household during this period, a conclusion drawn not from surviving contemporary documentation, which does not exist, but from the sheer consistency and geographic spread of oral tradition surrounding the case throughout Robertson County, long before Ingram's 1894 book brought the story to a national audience. Local histories and recollections predating Ingram's work, while not offering the same narrative detail found in his later account, do consistently reference a Bell family haunting as an established piece of local knowledge well before it became a commercially published sensation. This leaves researchers in an unusually difficult position. A case widely believed, even by skeptics, to reflect some genuine historical experience, yet lacking any surviving primary documentation from the actual period in question, and filtered instead through nearly a century of oral tradition before its first detailed written account emerged, an account itself impossible to fully verify against any earlier written source. Did the Bell family of Robertson County genuinely experience a sustained, unexplained torment between 1817 and 1821? Its true nature obscured today only by the passage of time and the absence of contemporary documentation? Or did a combination of adolescent distress, family conflict, and decades of embellished retelling gradually transform a much smaller, more explicable series of domestic troubles into one of America's most enduring ghost stories? The farmhouse itself is gone, and the cave that remains offers only atmosphere, not answers, leaving the Bell Witch exactly where nearly 2 centuries of storytelling have left it, neither fully confirmed nor fully explained away. The Bell Witch left behind a farmhouse long since torn down, its truth buried somewhere beneath decades of retelling. Our next mystery begins not with a haunting, but with a young man who appeared, seemingly from nowhere, in the streets of a German city, carrying no memory of where he came from, and leaving behind after his death a question about his origins that has never been definitively resolved. Nuremberg, Bavaria, was in 1828 a city of considerable size and civic order, hardly the kind of place where a stranger might wander unnoticed. Yet, on the afternoon of May 26th of that year, a young man appeared in one of the city's public squares, disoriented, poorly dressed, and apparently unable to communicate in any coherent way beyond a few repeated phrases. When questioned by local authorities, he could offer almost nothing about himself. Not his origins, not his family, not even a clear account of how he had come to be standing there. He carried a letter, unsigned, claiming he had been left in the anonymous writer's care as an infant and had been kept in strict isolation ever since. The young man identified himself in halting speech as Kaspar Hauser. What followed was one of the most extensively documented and thoroughly debated mystery cases of 19th century Europe. A case that drew the attention of legal authorities, medical professionals, and eventually European nobility, without ever producing a fully agreed-upon explanation for who Hauser actually was or why he had appeared in Nuremberg in the condition he did. Hauser's own account, pieced together gradually as his ability to communicate improved under the care of local officials, and later, a sympathetic legal scholar named Anselm von Feuerbach described a childhood spent in near total isolation within a small, darkened room, fed only bread and water, with no human contact beyond an unseen caretaker who occasionally appeared to tend to his basic needs. According to Hauser, he had no awareness of the outside world at all until shortly before his appearance in Nuremberg, when the same caretaker taught him to walk and speak a small number of phrases before abandoning him in the city. Medical examinations conducted shortly after his discovery reported findings consistent, in the physician's assessment at the time, with a young man who had indeed spent an extended period in physical confinement. His skin unusually pale and sensitive to light, his muscles underdeveloped in ways consistent with limited physical activity, and his overall demeanor markedly unfamiliar with basic aspects of ordinary social interaction and sensory experience that most children absorb naturally over the course of childhood development. If genuine, Hauser's account described an extraordinary and deeply troubling case of prolonged childhood imprisonment, its motive and perpetrator entirely unknown. But it was the speculation surrounding who might have been responsible, and why, that transformed Hauser's case from a troubling local mystery into a matter of considerable European political intrigue. The most persistent and widely circulated theory, championed most notably by von Feuerbach himself, proposed that Hauser was, in fact, a prince of the House of Baden, secretly removed from his rightful position as an infant and replaced with a dying substitute child, as part of a succession dispute within the Baden royal family. Under this theory, Hauser's imprisonment was orchestrated by rival family members seeking to secure the succession for an alternative line of the family, with Hauser's isolated confinement intended not to kill him outright, but to remove him from any position to challenge the succession, while avoiding the moral and political complications a direct assassination might have posed. This theory gained considerable traction throughout the 19th century and remains a subject of ongoing historical debate today, fueled in part by circumstantial details that some researchers considered suggestive, including physical descriptions of Hauser noted by contemporaries as bearing resemblance to members of the Baden ruling family, and the timing of his appearance relative to specific, documented succession disputes within that same family during the relevant period. Yet the theory has never been definitively proven, and significant skepticism has persisted from the moment it was first proposed, with critics noting the absence of any conclusive documentary evidence directly linking Hauser to the Baden family, beyond circumstantial resemblance and politically convenient timing. Modern genetic analysis has attempted to resolve this specific question more definitively. DNA testing conducted in the 1990s and again in the following decade, using preserved samples believed to be associated with Hauser, produced results that some researchers interpreted as inconsistent with a direct genetic connection to the House of Baden, while other researchers have raised methodological concerns regarding the reliability and chain of custody of the specific samples tested, leaving the genetic question, much like the historical one, without a fully settled resolution accepted by all parties involved in the ongoing debate. Beyond the specific Baden royal theory, other explanations for Hauser's origins and condition have been proposed across the decades, ranging from the considerably more skeptical to the far more speculative. Some contemporaries and later historians have suggested Hauser may simply have been an elaborate fraud, a young man of unremarkable origins who fabricated his account of childhood imprisonment for reasons of personal attention, financial support, or social advancement, exploiting the sympathy and curiosity his mysterious appearance generated among Nuremberg's civic and legal authorities. Under this theory, his apparent unfamiliarity with basic social behaviors and sensory experiences may have been deliberately performed rather than genuinely experienced, a possibility given some support by later observations from certain contemporaries who grew skeptical of inconsistencies they noted in Hauser's behavior and account over time. This skeptical theory gained further weight from Hauser's own subsequent, and ultimately fatal, entanglement in additional mysterious incidents following his initial appearance in Nuremberg. In October 1829, Hauser reported being attacked by a hooded assailant who inflicted a wound to his forehead, an incident some contemporaries suspected Hauser may have staged himself, whether to maintain public sympathy and support or to reinforce his own account of being targeted by unknown enemies connected to his mysterious origins. No assailant was ever identified or apprehended in connection with this earlier attack. The matter took a considerably more serious turn in December 1833, when Hauser was fatally wounded by a stab wound to the chest, reportedly inflicted during a meeting with an unknown man in a public park, to whom Hauser claimed he had been lured under the pretense of receiving information regarding his true parentage. Hauser died from this wound days later. Once again, no assailant was ever definitively identified, and the incident has been interpreted in dramatically different ways depending on which broader theory of Hauser's identity and motives an investigator or historian favors. Under the royal conspiracy theory, this final, fatal attack represents the successful culmination of a long-standing plot to eliminate a legitimate claimant to the Baden succession, carried out once it became clear Hauser's continued survival, and growing public profile posed an unacceptable ongoing risk to those responsible for his original confinement. Under the fraud theory, by contrast, some researchers have proposed the wound may have been self-inflicted, whether accidentally during a staged incident intended to generate further sympathy and support, or, in a more tragic interpretation, deliberately reflecting psychological distress that had built over years of increasing scrutiny and skepticism directed at his account. Modern forensic reassessment of the surviving details surrounding Hauser's fatal wound has produced ongoing disagreement among researchers regarding which explanation better fits the available evidence, without resolving the underlying question definitively in either direction. What remains undisputed is that a young man of genuinely unknown origin appeared in Nuremberg in 1828, in a condition that convinced numerous contemporary medical and legal professionals of genuine, significant childhood deprivation, generated intense royal and political speculation throughout German-speaking Europe, and ultimately died under violent and still unexplained circumstances 5 years later, having never definitively revealed, or perhaps never definitively known himself, the true nature of his origins. Was Kaspar Hauser a secret prince of Baden, imprisoned to remove him from a succession dispute, and ultimately murdered once that imprisonment failed to fully neutralize the threat he represented? Or was he an elaborate fraud, whose fabricated account of childhood suffering ultimately entangled him in real danger he could no longer control or explain away? Nearly 2 centuries later, despite legal inquiry, royal scrutiny, and modern genetic analysis, the question first posed on that Nuremberg street in 1828 remains exactly what it was then. A young man and a story that history has never been able to fully verify or fully dismiss.